What's up everyone, how are you all? Today we are back with another blazing Naruto story. What if Naruto abandoned his pregnant lover? If you enjoy then please like, share and do comments, and also check the description box to original creator of this beautiful creation. Damn it. Naruto slammed his fist into the coarse bark of the tree, reveling in the brief sting of pain that came with the brutal action. He wasn't worried about cuts or scars. The Kyuubi would fix everything in a matter of seconds, and as soon as he did, he slammed his fist into the tree again. It's not fair. He felt minuscule amounts of the fox's sinister chakra began to seep out, but he didn't give a fuck. With the way he was feeling, he wouldn't mind using it to level Konoha himself. At least then he wouldn't have to see their happy, grinning faces every day. She should be in love with me. But he couldn't hate them. They were two of his closest friends, and as long as they were happy, he was happy. Or at least, that's what he tried to tell himself. He slammed his fist into the tree for the 15th time, finding that with each punch the pain lessened. The back of his eyeballs burned with tears, and he was suddenly finding it hard to breathe. What am I doing? He punched the tree once more, staring at the deep indentation left in the bark. It really was unfair. After rushing to the wave country, decimating a reincarnated Orochimaru, and bringing Sasuke back to Konoha, he was left with nothing. Sakura had immediately forgotten all about the guy who'd protected, loved, and been there for her for years. Naruto chuckled bitterly at his thoughts. What had he expected? Did he really think that if he brought Sasuke back to her, she'd love him? It was a fool's dream to begin with. He could still feel the deep aching in his chest when he'd found the two of them making out on top of the Hokage monument, his favorite spot. If he didn't know any better, he'd say that they were mocking him. He was so absorbed in his thoughts, that he neglected to sense the kunai heading straight for his lower back. The knife sliced into his flesh, digging deeply into the soft area next to his spine. Naruto cursed loudly. What kind of shinobi was he if he left himself open to such an obvious attack? Still, whoever had thrown the knife either had shitty aim, or they weren't intending to kill him. Wincing lightly, he speedily pulled the blade from his back and turned to greet his attacker, only to blink in surprise as an obviously enraged Tenten stomped towards him. The girl's dark brown eyes were glued to the ground in front of her, and she clenched her fists tightly at her sides as she looked for her stray kunai. She was not having a good day. And that was an understatement. Ever since she'd gotten out of bed that morning, her day had been steadily going downhill. First, her alarm clock had neglected to go off that morning. Normally, that wasn't such a big deal since she only had training with Neji, Lee, and Guy. However, this morning was special. Very special. The local grocery store was having a once-in-lifetime half-off of everything going out of business sale, and she just so happened to be running extremely low on funds. Contrary to popular belief, the only shinobi who made any real money were Anbu officers. Needless to say, by the time she'd gotten to the store, there was nothing, absolutely nothing, left on the shelves. Hell, even the canned bear meat was sold out, and no one ever ate that shit. Unfortunately, that was only the start of her horrible day. In her rush to get to the supermarket, she'd somehow managed to lose her purse, the very same purse that contained her food money for the next week, her shinobi ID, makeup kit, and her favorite brand of perfume. Very expensive perfume, the kind of perfume you'd have to whore yourself out 4 weeks to buy. In the shinobi world, that was pretty damn expensive. Shortly after that, the heel of her left shoe had broken. How the hell is that even possible? A bucket of fish water had fallen on her head. She'd been chased around the village by a horde of hungry cats, fallen down a manhole, and run into a conveniently placed pole while swatting away flies and cats. Oh, but that wasn't the end of it. After returning home for a shower, she discovered that she had forgotten to pay her gas and electric bill. As such, the water was ice cold as it blasted against her lightly tanned skin. The shock was so overwhelming that she'd hopped out of the shower stall, only to trip over her own feet and land flat on her face. As if that wasn't enough, she'd ripped her favorite pair of pants while getting dressed again, accidentally dropped her shirt in the toilet, and spilled the last of her lotion all over the bed. She scowled in remembrance of the day's events, kicking a random squirrel out of her way. Even when she was trying to let off some steam by training, she somehow managed to mess up. One of her kunai had slipped out of her hand as she was throwing it and sped off into the forest behind her. It just wasn't fair. Maybe the demon lord of fate was after her now, finally bored of fucking with her uptight teammate Neji. Yes, that had to be it. She stalked into the clearing to look for kunai, eyes fervently searching the ground for any sign of the lost weapon. She knew it was around her somewhere, she'd seen it head off in this direction as soon as it had left her hand. Looking for this? A monotone voice asked, a hint of annoyance in the man's tone. She snapped her head up to see Uzumaki Naruto staring at her with a less than pleased frown on his face. Her eyes widened in shock, and she immediately closed the distance between them with fear. Oh, no, don't tell me that hit you. I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. It just slipped out of my hand and… It's okay, it just nicked me, he lied, feeling somewhat relieved by her worried reaction. Granted, it was probably because she didn't want to have to pay any medical bills or recompensate him for pain and suffering, but it was nice to have someone worrying over him for once. Tenten glared up at him disbelievingly, crossing her arms underneath her chest. You're lying. The Demon Lord's been using me as his personal riding bitch today, so I know it did more than nick you. Let me see it. Naruto lifted a slightly confused eyebrow, feeling his previous anger slowly ebb away. The Demon Lord? The young woman blushed lightly and shook her head, embarrassed at having mentioned her made-up antagonist out loud. Her eyes drifted to the deep, fist-sized crater in the tree behind him, causing her to furrow her brows in slight worry. There looked like there was blood inside and around the edges of the hole, but a brief glance at his knuckles relieved her of her momentary panic. Brushing the issue off, she turned her gaze back to the waiting blonde in front of her. Nothing, and stopped changing the subject. Where did it hit you? I told you, it didn't really hit me. Liar. Then just show me. Wait a few seconds. Huh? No. What if you're bleeding to death? If you don't show me the wound, I'll find it myself. Mildly annoyed, Naruto lifted his arms out to his sides and spread his legs, essentially assuming the position. If she wanted to find it, he wouldn't make it easy on her. Go ahead. She blinked in surprise at the willing gesture, but slowly stepped up until she was standing directly in front of him. She didn't know why she was doing this. If he said he was fine, he was fine. Still, if he suddenly passed out and died from blood loss, she didn't want to have to explain to her mentor how she'd accidentally killed the woman's foster brother. Tenten glanced up to look at his frowning face before slowly reaching a shaky hand towards his bright orange shirt. A simple black plus sign sat directly in the center of the garment, enclosed by a small circle. She hesitantly lifted the hem of his shirt above his belly button, searching for any sign of blood. It was a lot tougher since she didn't know exactly where she'd hit him, and she hoped against hope that it was somewhere that wouldn't require the removal of his pants. On second thought, she'd better not hope for much. Taking a deeper breath, she lifted his shirt all the way up to his chest. Her eyes nearly gawked at the pounds of muscle adorning his torso, and she wondered what the hell kind of training he had done to get those kinds of results. The only people she knew that had a body like that were Guy and Lee, and they trained nearly every hour on the hour. A brief shudder went through her as she remembered the first and last time she'd seen the two of them topless. That was something she hoped to never, ever see again. She shook her head to concentrate on the matter at hand, scolding herself for becoming distracted by the boy's physique. She briefly ran her eyes over his front, and finding nothing wrong, moved around until she's standing behind him. Repeating the steps she'd taken on the other side of his body, she scanned his back for any sign of damage. Surprisingly enough, Naruto had been telling the truth when he said the knife had just nicked him. There was nothing but a tiny pink cut next to his spine, surrounded by a small smidgen of blood. Still feeling a bit guilty, she used the sleeve of her white top to wipe away the red fluid. See? Told you, Naruto called, glancing over his shoulder to look at the smaller girl. That doesn't change the fact that I hit you. She lowered his shirt and paused and thought. To be completely honest, she'd never paid much attention to the younger boy in all her years of knowing him. Sure, she'd been mildly impressed when he had beaten Neji in the Chunin exams, but that was as far as her interest in him went. Admittedly, her interest had spiked again when she'd heard that Naruto had brought Tsunade, her mentor and one of the legendary Sannin, back to Konoha to serve as the Godem Hokage. All of a sudden, she wished that she'd taken a little bit more interest in him than she had. Then, maybe this situation wouldn't be so dreadfully awkward. She stepped around the Junin until she was standing directly in front of him, looking both miffed and apologetic. I'd offered to treat you to some ramen or something, but I lost my purse earlier today. The boy curiously titled his head, for the first time since she'd arrived, showing an emotion other than annoyance. He dug around in his loose black pants for a few seconds before emerging with, to her absolute shock, a small brown pocketbook. "Is this yours?" Tenten reached out and took the item from his hand, staring at it in awe. She was certain she'd never see it again. Despite Konoha being the supposedly most noble ninja village of them all, over half of the shinobi and civilian population were immoral bastards. If they thought that they could get away with it, the fuckers would steal your money, kill you, rape your dead body, and set it on fire before attempting to put the flames out with their own piss. Really, she'd seen it happen. "Yes, thank you. So, about that ramen." The young woman shrugged her shoulders nonchalantly, completely unaware of exactly how much ramen the boy could put away in one sitting. "Sure, I did say I'd treat you." She watched amused as his eyes lit up with joy, and he grabbed her arm to lead her to the market district. His grip was a lot stronger than she would have expected. Maybe he thought she was going to make a run for it. The two of them practically ran through the crowded streets of Konoha towards his favorite ramen stand, bobbing and weaving through the crowds at an alarmingly fast pace. While he was able to avoid touching most of the people on the narrow road, Tenten wasn't so lucky. She'd bumped, crashed, grinded, and thoroughly dry-humped nearly every person they'd run past, leaving her feeling more than a little violated. Tugging roughly on the blonde's hand, she managed to slow him down long enough for her to catch her breath. Why are you in such a rush?" she stammered out between pants, resting her hands on her red-clothed knees. He smiled a bit sheepishly, scratching at the back of his head with a hesitant hand. "Sorry, I guess I got a bit carried away. You're the first person my age to treat me to ramen." Tenten's eyebrows lifted a bit in surprise at this new bit of information. She would have thought that at least Sakura would buy him a couple of bowls considering how long they'd known each other. Still, she was a bit annoyed that he'd left her in the dust, and placing her dainty hands on her waist, she glared up at him. "And I'll be the last if this is how you treat the people who do you favors." Naruto stared down at her incredulously, mouth opening in shock. "What? You're only doing this because you stabbed me with a fucking kunai? Hey, it was an accident, and it only nicked you. As far as I'm concerned, I don't owe you anything." The blonde furrowed his brows, his glare never wavering for a second. He couldn't argue. No matter how much he wanted to tell her that the kunai had indeed stabbed him in the lower back, and that she owed him a whole lot more, he couldn't. That'd require that he'd tell her everything. His gaze suddenly turning cold, he turned his back on the shorter girl. "You're right, you don't owe me anything." Ironically, the same could be said for his situation with Sakura. She didn't owe him anything, either. Just because he'd brought back Sasuke didn't mean that she was required to go out with him. In the back of his mind, he'd known that he didn't have a chance anyway. He felt his eyes began to burn with tears, and cursing his own weakness, began to walk away. Tenten watched his back with no small amount of confusion. Okay, there was definitely something wrong with him. Although she didn't know him that well, she did know that the normal Naruto would still be standing in front of her, yelling at the top of his lungs to get his point across. She'd never heard of him backing away from a fight no matter how hopeless or trivial it was, and feeling slightly concerned and guilty, jogged after him. "Naruto, wait up," she called, doing her best to avoid the many patrons crowding the walkway. She sighed in relief when he actually listened, and easily managed to catch up in a few seconds. "Look, I was just kidding around when I said it'd be the last time. I didn't think you'd take it to heart. I'll still treat you if you want to go." The blonde felt the beginnings of guilt welling up inside of him. Being pissed off about Sasuke and Sakura's relationship didn't give him the right to yell at someone else. He pasted a false grin on his face and grabbed her wrist again, this time much gentler than he had the first time. "Yosh, let's go." They were only a skip and a hop from the restaurant, so it took the two of them all of 5 minutes to get there. Naruto stepped into the small ramen stand, followed by a slightly hesitant Tenten. "Oi, old man, a bowl of miso," he yelled, instantly feeling a little better inside of the small restaurant. The shop owner turned around in surprise, staring at Naruto as if he'd grown another head. "Not that I'm complaining, but didn't you already eat lunch here earlier?" the man asked, eyebrows raised well into his forehead. It was rare that the boy would stop by the small stand more than once a day. Naruto jerked his thumb towards the brown-haired girl at his side, his fake grin widening a bit more. "She's treating Tucci shot Tenten a look of pity before turning back to the stove to prepare some noodles. Ah, I see. He turned his head enough to look at the confused girl. What'll you have? A bowl of vegetable ramen and a bottle of sake, please. Noticing the blonde's shocked stare, she scowled and crossed her arms under her chest. What? Shinobi are allowed to drink at the age of 16, and I'm 18. She didn't know why she was defending herself in the first place. Yeah, but why? Tenten, feeling a bit patronized by his question, stiffly shrugged her shoulders. Because it helps to get my mind off things. A lot of bad stuff happened today, and I plan to get drunk enough to forget all about them. With the same annoyingly shocked stare on his face, he tilted his head in his trademark fashion, looking straight into Tenten's brown eyes. To be honest, he'd never understood why people drank sake in the first place. The stuff tasted like a mix between vinegar and the dirty water left over after washing his underwear. In other words, like shit. Still, curiosity won out over his surprise, and he regarded the girl with a small frown. What kind of stuff? The girl felt like laughing out loud at the innocent question. God, where did she begin? Turning around on her stool so that she was facing him, she began to relay each and every horrible thing that had happened to her, often evoking a loud snort or chuckle from Naruto. They were so wrapped up in their conversation that neither of them paid much attention to the food when it arrived, and that was quite a shock considering the boy's penchant for ramen. And finally, I accidentally nicked one of my comrades in the back with the lost kunai. He laughed again and turned to his now lukewarm ramen, shoveling a mouthful of the dish into his mouth. Sounds like a rough day, he commented, swallowing the food in his mouth. Tenten laughed along with him and poured herself a small saucer of sake. Rough doesn't begin to describe it. I'm just glad that the day's almost over. She downed the serving of alcohol in one gulp, reveling in the familiar bitter taste that accompanied the drink. The tingling burn she felt seemed to rejuvenate her tired body, and let out a loud sigh as she felt the liquid settle in her belly. So, what about you? What were you doing way out on the 20th training field? Watching his face, she noticed that his expression seemed to darken a bit. The same thing you were doing. Abandoning the conversation, he turned his full attention to the cooling food in front of him, shoving another mouthful of noodles into his mouth. Not one to be easily put off, Tenten leaned forward until she literally raping his personal space. You were letting off steam too? What for? When he didn't answer, she slid a saucer of sake over to the eating blonde. If all else fails, get them drunk. He stared down at the shallow cup with a small frown, already reeling from the strong, bitter smell of the alcohol. What's wrong? Tenten asked, a challenging grin appearing on her face. Is the great Uzumaki Naruto afraid of a little sake? The blonde growled in the back of his throat, doing his best to tune the girl out. I thought you never backed down from a challenge. Peeved, I should have known you were all talk and no action. Shut up, he roared, startling the old man behind the counter. He grabbed the shallow dish and downed the drink in one gulp, missing the wide grin that was breaking out on Tenten's face. She began to laugh when he choked and sputtered because of the burn that accompanied the strong liquid. Well, what do you know, you do have some balls. Here, have another. She refilled his dish and stared at him expectantly. After recovering enough to speak, Naruto shot her his meanest glare and pushed the cup away. No way, that shit almost killed me. What, this stuff? Lifting the dish to her mouth, she easily swallowed the alcohol without so much as a cough. Only a wimp couldn't handle a little sake. To be honest, she was already starting to feel the effects of the alcohol in her system. Naruto looked just a little bit blurry as compared to a few seconds ago. Fine, gimme that. He snatched the cup off of the counter, boisterously drinking and swallowing another serving. He somehow managed to avoid choking, and satisfied that he'd successfully downed the fluid, shot her a challenging grin. Easy. Unfortunately for him, Tenten wasn't quite done. She motioned for the shop owner to bring her another couple of bottles of sake, much to the old man's chagrin. It wasn't his place to tell a customer what they should and shouldn't be doing, and as much as he wanted to put a stop to the drinking game, he knew nothing short of knocking the teens out would end their dangerous play. With a heavy sigh, he placed 2 more bottles onto the counter, frowning as the girl immediately set about refilling their saucers. 2 cups? She taunted, staring him in the eyes. Only a bitch can't handle more than that. She threw back another serving of sake before slamming it back down, grinning when he did the same. She watched amused as his eyes seemed to cross for a second, and briefly wondered if hers were doing the same. The game continued for many more rounds, each of them managing to get down 15 servings of sake. By now the entire restaurant was blurry except for certain items coming in and out of focus at random times. She suddenly remembered her original goal, and casually drinking another saucer of sake, she turned in the direction she believed Naruto was seated. "So, what was you pissed off 'bout?" she slurred, body wavering ever so slightly. The blonde too drank another cup and shrugged. "Yeah no, seems sorta stupid now. I saw Sakura-chan in Sasuke Teme making out and shit, so I fucked up, da first thing I sawed. Know what's real fucked up? I brought da bastard back for her, and she started fucking him the first chance she got." As if understanding what he was saying, when she really didn't, Tenten gaily nodded her head. "Yeah man, that's some fucked up shit there. I know what dat shit feels like." The ramen store owner could only shake his head in exasperation as Tenten tilted one of their many bottles into the air, swallowing everything that was left in the small white container. "Oi, old man, gimme a nutter," she yelled, slamming her hand on the countertop. Finally drawing the line, Tucci grabbed the empty bottles and pulled them back into the kitchen, tossing them into the recycle bin sitting next to the sink. "I'm cutting you two off for the night. I don't want to be responsible for you guys getting alcohol poisoning." The kunoichi growled viciously and flipped the man off with a perfectly manicured finger, pushing herself into what she assumed was a standing position. "Fuck you, tosser. Come on Naruto, let's get outta here." The blonde too shot the surprised store owner a middle finger, and tossing some bills onto the wooden surface, staggered out of the roadside stand with Tenten leaning against him for support. Tucci could only sigh as the two of them ran smack dab into a telephone pole, nearly causing it to uproot and fall over. If those two were supposed to be Konoha's future, they were all fucked. "Shit, man, did you see da look on that punk bitch's face when we flipped, I am off?" Tenten practically shouted as they swaggered towards the residential district. Naruto laughed out loud, showing every one of his clear white teeth. "Hell yeah, fuck, fucking badass for a chick, you know dat? I'm fucking serious man, you're like the awesomest bitch I know." The kunoichi joined him in his laughter, having to hold her arm out in front of herself to keep them from falling over. "Nah, dude, you're pretty boss yourself. Shit, I dunno why the hell you don't got a girlfriend. You a fag or something?" He laughed again, nearly tripping over his own feet for the 5th time since they'd set out for. "Oi, where da hell are we going anyway?" Naruto asked, the first smart thing that had come out of his mouth since they began drinking. Tenten flashed him a flirtatious grin. There were two types of drunks in the world, happy drunks and sad drunks. Happy drunks tended to become exceedingly horny, flirtatious, and, well, happy. Sad drunks tended to become suicidal, depressed, and an all-around horrible person to be around. Fortunately, or unfortunately, depending on your point of view, Tenten was a happy drunk. "To my place." She led him up the stairs to her flat, holding onto the railing for dear life as she ascended. It didn't help that the entire world was spinning around her, nor that she was having trouble figuring out which was way up and which way was down. Luckily for both of them, her apartment was the first door at the top of the stairs, otherwise, there was a strong chance that one or both of them would have fallen over the protective railing fencing in the second floor. After fumbling around in her deep red pants for 2 minutes looking for her keys, she pouted slightly and glanced back at the blonde behind her. "Help me out here, I can't find my fucking keys." Naruto blinked in confusion for a few seconds, staring at her as if she'd grown another head. He eventually understood what she wanted him to do, and with a small grunt, he jammed his large hands into her back pockets to help her look. The girl squealed loudly at the contact, uncharacteristically breaking out into a fit of giggles. "Fucking perv." Grinning widely, Naruto squeezed her ass through her pants, causing her to shriek again. She pressed herself snugly up against his larger body, shivering when she felt his shallow breath against her neck. He reeked of ramen and cheap sake, but then again, so did she. The feel of something hard pressing into her lower back caused her to freeze momentarily, and she shifted her position a bit to find a more comfortable spot. It wasn't until he groaned softly into her ear that she understood what the object that had been poking her was. Giggling once again, she deliberately rubbed herself against him, pretending to still be searching for her keys. For his part, Naruto felt like he was in heaven and hell at the same time. The immense amounts of pleasure he was receiving was murder on his nervous system, and he briefly wondered if it was her goal to drive him mad with her teasing. Luckily for him, he was temporarily put of his misery when she finally emerged with a small set of keys. "Found him," she exclaimed, jiggling the pieces of metal in front of his eyes. She reluctantly stepped away from his body, and after 2 or 3, 9 or 10 tries, managed to smoothly slip the correct key into the lock. She quickly opened and stumbled into the door, loudly banging the doorknob against the adjacent wall. Her mind didn't even register the noise, however, as she was focused on one thing and one thing only: Naruto. Tenten pulled him into her apartment and shut the door behind him as if sealing his fate. Her eyes were dark with lust, and rushing up to the equally horny blonde, she roughly shoved him up against the door and slammed her lips to his in a sloppy kiss. Their hands roamed over each other's bodies, feeling, touching, and thoroughly molesting everything they could. It hadn't even occurred to her that this was her first kiss, nor that she had absolutely no idea what or why she was doing it. All she knew was that it felt damn good. She forcefully shoved her tongue into his mouth, briefly recalling the stories Ino had told her about her many conquests with the shinobi population. That simple action provided twice as much pleasure as meager lip-on-lip contact did, and she moaned in joy when Naruto's tongue joined hers in an oral wrestling match. The battle for dominance was incredibly fierce as both ninja fought for control, a battle which Tenten quickly lost when his hands somehow managed to snake their way up her shirt to loosely cup her ass. Naruto," she moaned, breaking the kiss to tilt her head back in bliss. This was far better than any romance novel or story she'd ever heard, and 10 times more intense. What the fuck had she been missing out on for all of these years? She moaned again when he attacked the newly exposed skin of her neck, licking and sucking at the tender flesh as if his life depended on it. It felt so fucking good that she couldn't help but wonder if he'd done this before. Not wanting to be so easily outdone, she slipped her hands into the front of loose black pants, sliding the appendages lower and lower until they gripped something both hard and soft at the same time. She couldn't help but marvel at how hot the pulsing organ was, and how large it felt in comparison to her calloused hands. A smile broke out on her face when he stopped his attack on her neck long enough to groan, and she instantly knew that she'd gained control again. She slowly began to pump the throbbing rob resting in her hands, reveling in the soft moans and whimpers coming from Naruto's throat. It was almost as if she were holding all of the world's power in her hands, a power great enough to bring even the strongest of men to their knees. So absorbed in her miniature power trip, Tenten missed the removal of his hands from her ass until he had easily hefted her up by her thighs, bringing her high enough to where he could freely capture her lips in another bone-searing kiss. "Bedroom," he muttered, breaking the lip lock long enough for her to answer. She pointed to her left and latched her lips onto his again, hanging on for dear life as he walked the both of them to her queen-sized bed. Unfortunately for both of them, Naruto found it nearly impossible to navigate through the dark apartment drunk, even more so with a vigorously active girl in his arms. After much stumbling, crashing, and pain, he eventually made it to the oh-so-holy sanctuary known as Tenten's bedroom. Without so much as a warning, he threw her back first onto the feather-filled mattress before jumping onto the bed after her, fully intending to continue their amorous activities. He wasn't counting on Tenten expertly rolling him onto his back so that she was straddling him. He watched wide-eyed as she reached into the pouch still attached to the back of her pants and emerged with a single sharpened kunai, effortlessly slicing the shirt open down the front and ripping it off of him. "Did you really have to do that?" he asked, panting in both nervousness and exertion. Rather than answer, she eagerly attached her lips to his left, sucking ferociously on the small protruding bud. She smiled around the teat when he began to writhe under her, and quickly brought her other hand up to massage the right one. She switched sides after almost a minute of this, connecting her mouth to the right and using her hand to toy with the other. God, Tenten, having had enough of her delicious torture, he suddenly sat up on the bed, evoking a small meep from the smaller girl on top of him. Naruto grabbed the bottom of her shirt and began to pull it up, smirking slightly when she earnestly lifted her arms above her head to assist him. "Like what you see," Tenten teased, cupping her ass for added effect. She was exceedingly glad that she'd foregone wearing a bra that day, as that was one less step they had to go through. Her smile widened when she realized that he was still stuck on her chest, and she took that chance to quickly unbuckle his pants and pull both them and his boxers off of him. That same smile turned into a "oh" of shock as she got a good look at what he was working with. The thing had to be every bit of 7 inches long, pretty impressive considering what she'd heard and read about a man's penis. For the first time since they'd started, she felt a small bit of fear edging out the overwhelming lust permeating throughout her body. She wasn't sure if that thing would fit in her admittedly petite body without bursting through her cervix first. Luckily for both of them, her lust far outweighed the fear, and she hurriedly stripped off her own pants and panties and straddled the now very nervous Naruto. She gripped his pulsating rod and placed at the entrance to her vagina, biting her lip as she stared down into his cerulean blue eyes. Scared? He slowly shook his head, a tiny smile appearing on his still somewhat childish face. Hell no. Good. Closing her eyes tightly, she leaned forward and captured his lips in another kiss before all but slamming herself down onto him. While it did hurt a bit, the pain wasn't nearly as bad as she'd thought it would be. She chalked the small phenomenon up to the fact that she was a kunoichi, drunk, and that her hymen had been broken years ago while training. Still, she broke the kiss and leaned forward onto his chest, struggling to get used to the feeling of having something so large inside of her. It was a strange feeling, but not at all unpleasant. She felt, well, full. "Are you okay?" Naruto asked, awkwardly rubbing her back as she leaned against him. She nodded into his chest, and as if confirming her answer, Tenten slowly began to move against him. The effect was immediate. Both Junin gasped out in pleasure, unused to the intense feelings emanating from their conjoined genitals. Everything they'd done up until this point was like child's play compared to the main event. She paused momentarily to catch her breath, barely able to believe that something so simple could feel so fucking good. She rested for a few more seconds before resuming their act, grinding against him at a much quicker pace than before. Every nerve in her body felt like it was being dipped into a pool of molten lava, and she was forced to leave her mouth wide open lest she suffocate. Naruto placed light, slow kisses along the left side of her neck and collarbone, wrapping his right arm around her waist to help her slide against him. It took every ounce of his concentration not to explode right there, and if he didn't do something to distract himself, he wouldn't last more than a minute. With that thought in mind, he brought his left hand up to her S, idly rubbing and pinching the S. Her moans intensified considerably, and he suddenly felt her begin to speed up against him. "Fuck, I'm not gonna last long if you go that fast." Still, Tenten paid him no mind and increased her pace even more, shaking the entire bed with her movements. She was exceedingly glad that her mattress was stuffed with feathers rather than coil springs. Otherwise, she was certain that she would have awakened the entire building with her activities. Her face slick with sweat, she once again leaned forward to kiss him, practically jamming her tongue down his throat in the process. She distantly noted that the buns in her had come loose, and as such, her long, shoulder-blade-length hair was bouncing freely around them, occasionally smacking one or both of them in the face. The slow burning in the bottom of her stomach was now a raging maelstrom, and breaking off the kiss once again, she leaned back to fully enjoy the pleasures Naruto was bestowing upon her. Naruto, she stuttered, her eyelids half closed and her mouth wide open. I'm. At that moment, her body suddenly stiffened and jerked on top of him, a loud shriek tearing its way out of her throat as her eyes shot open in bliss. She felt herself thrown into vicious spasms, and her toes curled and uncurled with delicious pleasure. Shortly after, her partner joined her in the throes of passion. "Ah, shit," he yelled, feeling himself begin to jerk and spasm like Tenten had done only moments before. He felt something shoot out of his painfully erect penis as his body exploded in pleasure, and he tightly closed his eyes to clear away the millions of stars flying around in front of him. It took both of them a full 3 minutes to come down from the temporary high known as an orgasm, and the two Junin relaxed against each other in post-coital bliss. It was easily the most thrilling and heart-pumping encounter that either of them had ever had the pleasure of experiencing. Naruto slowly leaned back until he was fully reclining against the soft, downy mattress. The brunette lay wantonly on top of him, already feeling unconsciousness begin to creep in at the edges of her vision. That was fucking amazing, Tenten drawled, leaning her head on his muscular chest. The blonde below her laughed lightly. Amazing, don't begin to describe that. She nodded her head minutely to show that she agreed before closing her eyes to get some well-deserved rest. Tenten groggily opened her eyes, quickly narrowing her dark brown orbs in a futile attempt to block out the sunlight. Groaning, she pushed herself up onto her haunches, a move that she quickly regretted when her head began to pound and throb as if a miniature parade of hippos were gaily stomping around inside of her brain. On second thought, it felt more like an alien chestburster was trying to claw its way out of her forehead. Yes, that was much closer to what she was feeling. She shivered lightly from the cool morning air, and deciding that she really didn't need to meet her team for training, lie back down on the warm, fleshy surface of her bed. It took her all of 5 seconds to realize that beds weren't supposed to be warm and fleshy, but instead, soft and cozy. Panicking, she pushed herself up into a crawling position and looked down at the lightly tanned skin below her. It looked like someone's chest, and a male's at that. Staring down at her own state of undress, she instantly made the heart-stopping connection that she'd slept with him. His heavily muscled chest rose and fell every few seconds, signaling that whoever it was probably still asleep, and she closed her eyes in silent prayer for the demon lord to grant her just one simple little wish. Please, please don't let it be Guy or Lee. Holding her breath in anxiousness, she opened her eyes and took a good look at the person's face. She let the breath go in relief when, instead of one of her gallantly youthful teammates, one Uzumaki Naruto lay unconscious beneath her. Shortly after, she screamed. Naruto snapped awake in an instant, hopping up and nearly throwing the girl on top of him onto the floor. His eyes were wide with panic as he quickly and efficiently scanned the room for enemy shinobi, his body smoothly transitioning into a basic defensive stance. That was a mistake. Not even a second later, his body crumbled to the floor in agony, and he was forced to hold his throbbing blonde head in his hands. "Ah, damn it," he yelled, pressing his forehead against the cool carpet of her room. He was hard-pressed to think of a time when he'd ever experienced so much pain at once, and it took every ounce of his willpower not to begin slamming his head against the floor in an attempt to relieve some of the pain. It didn't help that Tenten was still screaming. Luckily for him, she finally ran out of breath, panting with both exertion and what he presumed to be fear. It took him a few more seconds, but eventually Naruto pulled himself off of the floor and grabbed one of her bed sheets. "Here," he muttered, holding the cloth out with blushing cheeks. Tenten snatched the white sheet from his hand and wrapped it around herself, glaring up at him the entire time. "What the hell?" she screamed, eyes filled with murderous intent. "Why you?" The blonde frowned lightly, unsure of how to take the question. He managed to find his bright orange boxers and slip them on, plopping back down on the girl's feather-stuffed bed. "Hey, don't ask me. The last thing I remember was that you were treating me to ramen, and then..." A light bulb seemed to literally appear above his head, and he pointed an accusing finger at the half-naked kunoichi. "It's your fault. You made me drink sake, got me drunk, and then brought me back here and raped me." Tenten's mouth dropped open. Was he stupid? Annoyed by his, obviously, false accusation, she stood to her feet and pointed a finger right back at him. "How do I know you didn't rape me? You might have just been pretending to drink the sake, and instead waited until I was drunk enough for you to get your rocks off. Shut up. Stop trying to shift the blame onto me. It's your fault for forcing me to drink that shit in the first place." "My fault? Hey, don't blame me because you're so easily susceptible to peer pressure." Naruto gaped like a fish out of water, unable to find a viable argument. Well, fuck, she was right. The girl let out a tired sigh, rubbing at her forehead with the palm of her hand. "All of this yelling is making my head hurt, and it isn't getting us anywhere. I'm gonna make some coffee." She grabbed the bathrobe hanging on the doorknob of her bedroom door and quickly slipped it over her shoulders, allowing the bedsheet to pool around her ankles. Tenten limped out of the large room, wincing as she felt a few of the bones in her lower back snap back into place. Every area of her body dully throbbed with pain, especially the small area around her pelvis. Still, she was strangely satisfied to see that Naruto too had a little bit of trouble walking to her kitchen. At least she gave as good as she got. The blonde slowly eased himself into one of her small kitchen chairs, wincing at the tenderness of his prize and joy. He didn't know what the hell had happened last night, but for some reason, it felt as if a band of wild gorillas had literally had their way with him. He quickly shook his head to rid himself of that train of thought lest it go to places he'd rather not explore. "Want coffee?" she asked, the question coming out as more of a statement than an actual inquiry. Seeing his puzzled expression, she sighed and rested an impatient hand on her hip. It's good for hangovers. Well, you want it or not? Yeah, sure. She sighed again and scratched at her unruly brown hair, frowning at how tangled it had gotten in only one night. Giving up on the mess of knots for the time being, Tenten leaned her back against the sink and shot him a murderous glare. Listen, I don't know who did what or why, but don't read too much into it. No matter how you look at it, last night was an accident. There will not be a repeat performance. Naruto rolled his eyes and snorted, matching her glare with an indignant frown of his own. I'm glad we agree on something, even if this is your way of trying to split the blame between us when it was obviously your fault. She growled under her breath and stood upright again. You're still saying that? You should be lucky that I'm letting you off so easy for taking my virginity. Do you know how hard it's been to maintain my innocence for all these years? Of course I do. You took my virginity too. An awkward silence settled over the two Junin at his loud proclamation. Tenten wanted to say something, anything, but her brain refused to come up with a viable remark. Naruto turned his head away in what she presumed to be shame. Anyway, what's done is done. If it's okay with you, I'd like to forget this entire thing happened. The kunoichi grunted in a very unladylike fashion, crossing her arms over the front of her tightly secured robe. That's the smartest thing you've said all day. The shrill whistle of the kettle interrupted them before Naruto could retaliate with a snide statement of his own. Tenten hurriedly pulled the screaming pot off of the stove and poured the scalding liquid into a couple of mugs already laced with a few spoonfuls of instant coffee. Need help? Naruto asked from the small dining room, noticing the tough time she was having balancing the tray that held both the cups and condiments in one hand and a small pitcher of milk in the other. She shook her head slightly and wobbled over to the table, letting loose a sigh when she finally placed the items onto the hardwood surface before setting herself down in the only remaining chair. She immediately set to work adding in milk and sugar, stirring the contents with a tiny spoon she'd bought just for that purpose. Tenten lifted the cup to her lips and took a long sip, closing her eyes in bliss at the rich flavor the simple drink provided. God, that's good, she moaned, already feeling the throbbing in her head begin to subside by the tiniest amount. Naruto nodded his agreement, already halfway done with his cup. Yeah, but Ero-sen, I mean, Jiraiya says that you should drink a cup of water right after. I dunno if it works, though. He watched her nod slightly and take another sip, suddenly noticing something strange about the young woman. You look good with your hair down. Tenten choked on her coffee, spraying the dark liquid all over the table. What? Look, no matter what you say, there's no way in hell I'm sleeping with you again. Shocked, the blonde hopped to his feet in anger. I was just making an observation. Is this how you treat guys who give you a simple compliment? No wonder you were still a virgin. That was it. She slammed her hands onto the tabletop and pointed to the door, gritting her teeth in barely restrained anger. Leave, now. Naruto waltzed over to the exit, leaving his half-finished cup of coffee on the table. Gladly. Just as he was about to open the door, he remembered that he was only wearing a pair of boxers. His rage temporarily forgotten, the teenager sheepishly turned around to address the irate brunette once again. I need my— Before he could finish his sentence, a ripped orange shirt and a pair of black pants hit him square in the face. Thanks. Tenten sighed in exasperation, pinching the bridge of her nose to curb her rising headache. He was probably the most exhausting and infuriating person she'd ever met, or meet, in her life. Just hurry up and go. Muttering obscenities, Naruto slipped on the pants and, what was left of, his shirt. He opened the large wooden door, and sticking out his tongue, disappeared. Despite herself, the Junin felt the edge of her lips twitch at his immaturity. Yes, he was definitely the most exhausting person she'd ever met. Avoiding Uzumaki Naruto proved to be the most difficult thing she'd ever had to do in her life. The blonde was literally everywhere. The Hokage Tower, the training fields, the Hyuga mansion, she'd even run into him while shopping for underwear at Victoria's Secret. She was just about fed up with the loudmouth, and the next time she saw him, she swore to herself that he'd get a large piece of her mind. As if the demon lord himself was eavesdropping on her mental conversation, Naruto stepped out of the shinobi surplus store to her left, a large bag filled to the brim with what she presumed to be weapons. You again? Are you following me or something? Naruto asked, glaring down at her from the shop's exit. Tenten could do nothing but stare at the younger Junin, her mouth open wide enough for a parade of elephants to step inside. Oh no, the fuck he didn't. Though she hadn't been feeling too well for the past couple of days, she always had enough energy to put a loud, bratty little boy in his place. Me following you? You're the one who's following me. The blonde looked equally shocked at the accusation, his eyes figuratively growing to the size of dinner plates. No way. Why the hell would I want to do that? Because you're a good-for-nothing horny bastard who's trying to get back into my pants. What? Are you sure you aren't describing yourself? Why you? The smaller girl pounced on Naruto, knocking the already off-balance boy to the ground. She gripped him roughly around the collar, almost stretching the fabric of his black t-shirt. You're so lucky I have training with my team in 5 minutes. God, if you'd caught me 10 minutes earlier. She let the threat hang ominously in the air, allowing him to come up with his own ideas for what she'd do. Hopping off of him, she stood on slightly shaky feet and began to walk off down the sidewalk. Yeah, that's right, run away. Naruto yelled after her, shaking a fist in her direction. Tenten turned around long enough to flip him off before jogging towards the training grounds, leaving a very pissed-off blonde in her wake. She somehow managed to reach her destination with a couple of minutes to spare. Unfortunately, the short sprint left her badly out of breath and exhausted all over. Noticing her condition, Neji lifted a curious eyebrow and opened his mouth to speak. Did you just wake up? When Tenten vigorously shook her head, he stood from his seat underneath a tree and walked over to the panting girl. How far did you run? She held up a single finger, surprising him even more. 1 mile? An academy student could run that distance full speed without so much as breaking a sweat. Concerned, he studied her heaving figure with furrowed brows. Are you all right? She waved off his question with a single hand, lifting her head to look him in the eyes. Yeah, just gotta get my second wind, she panted between breaths. She inhaled deeply a few more times before forcing her body to stand upright. Where are Guy and Lee? He noticed her face looked a little paler than usual, and still watching her with a critical eye, motioned for her to take a seat on one of the stumps. They were here a few minutes ago. Guy proposed that we all take a lap around Konoha while we waited for you to arrive, and Lee, being Lee, exuberantly agreed. They should be back relatively soon. She nodded slowly, relaxing her posture a bit more now that she knew she had some time. More importantly, perhaps you should just head on home. If you are this tired after running only a mile, you will not be able to keep up with us during training. I'm fine, really. See? I've already recovered. She stood up to prove her point. Unfortunately, she was forced to sit back down only a few seconds later. Well, I'll have recovered by the time Guy and Lee re. Yosh. Tenten has arrived, Guy-sensei. Let us go all out during our training today. Fuck. Tenten hung her head, mumbling under her breath about demon lords and stupid blondes. Placing her hands on her knees, she hefted herself up once again. She wobbled for a few seconds, feeling her eyes begin to zoom out of focus from the sudden action, but she was eventually able to get a hold on her footing and slowly walked over to her youthful teammates. What's the plan for today? She asked, placing her hands on her hips. Guy shot her one of his infamous blinding grins, twisting his body into an incredibly strange and gay-looking pose. Ah, your youthful motivation excites me. Today, we'll do 1,000 push-ups, 500 sit-ups, 2,000 kicks and punches, and then we'll run 20 laps around Konoha. All while balancing a large rock on our heads. Tears formed at the edges of Lee's eyes, and he clenched his fists powerfully in front of himself. It was almost scary how much he looked like his teacher now that he had a Junin vest of his very own. Oh, Guy-sensei, I cannot wait. Let us pour our sweat and tears into our training so that we may rekindle our passionate flames of youth. The two men hugged fiercely, tears pouring down their cheeks as they sobbed. Well said, Lee, Guy-sensei. Lee, Guy-sensei. Lee, Guy-sens. Enough. Tenten screeched, stamping her foot in frustration. God, every damn time. I meant the plan for us normal humans. The older male seemed to consider this for a second, almost as if he just now understood what she was trying to say. A pretty sad thing considering that they went through this nearly every day. Ah, you meant that kind of training. Neji felt his eye twitch. Well, I suppose we can just do some light sparring for a while. Although, don't you think it'd be more fun to? No, Neji yelled, shocking his other teammates. He closed his eyes and coughed lightly, quickly regaining his composure. No, sparring is fine, Tenten? The kunoichi nodded and hurriedly stood in front of the Hyuga, assuming a basic taijutsu stance. Only a fool would want to spar against Guy or Lee so early in the morning. She watched as he shifted into the typical Jukin stance, already planning what moves she would make before they even started. Normally, one would fear fighting against a member of the fearsome Hyuga clan. Tenten, however, did not. She knew their techniques and stances like the back of her hand, and although she could never hope to perform them, she'd come up with plenty of counters for each one. She took a deep breath to calm herself down, feeling small nervous butterflies flittering around in her stomach. They'd been there all morning, and she was hoping that the exercise would help them go away. Ready when you are, Neji said, activating his Byakugan. That was all the invitation she needed. Immediately, she reached into her equipment pouch and pulled out 3 kunai, effortlessly sliding them between the open spaces between her fingers. She threw all 3 of the projectile weapons at her teammate, smirking when he effortlessly evaded each one. That was exactly what she'd been counting on. She tugged lightly on the chakra strings connected to each of the 3 knives, sending them flying back at the Hyuga prodigy for a second strike. At the same time, she reached into her pouch for another 3 kunai and hurled 2 of them towards his legs. The final was sent speeding towards his forehead in a straight line. A small smile appeared on Neji's face at her actions. If he were anyone but a Hyuga, it'd be incredibly tough to dodge her attack. The 3 kunai coming from the front kept him from dodging forward, and the other 3 kunai she'd thrown before were coming at her from the back and both of his sides respectively. The only way to avoid being hit was to jump, but once in the air, he'd be like a sitting duck for some of her more destructive weapons. Of course, none of this applied to him. He quickly whirled into a perfect kaiden, easily knocking the weapons away from himself. Unfortunately, his perfect defense had one small flaw. It was nearly impossible to stop once he was spinning at full speed. Tenten rushed her teammate at full speed, ignoring the burning pain in her lungs telling her to stop. Just as she was about to strike at the white-eyed boy, her vision suddenly blurred and her legs simply gave out on her, sending her tumbling towards the whirling blue sphere of chakra. She connected head-on with the jutsu and was sent flying 10 feet into the air, coming down hard on her back. He waited a few seconds for her to get up, and when she didn't so much as flinch from her position on the ground, he hastily cancelled the jutsu. Tenten, Neji yelled, white eyes wide as he stared over at her. He, along with an equally concerned Lee and Guy, rushed over to the eerily still girl. He slid to a stop in front of her, immediately kneeling down by her side. Tenten, wake up! Lee's bushy eyebrows knitted together with worry, and he too began to yell for her to wake. Tenten, gather your youthful energy and return to us. He shook her arm in attempt to rouse her, his frown deepening when the action had no effect. Neji, how could you? You've extinguished her burning passion well before its time. Lee? Neji asked, shifting his eyes away from Tenten for a second. Yes, my nefariously youthful rival? Shut up. He turned his attention back to the unconscious kunoichi lying on the lush green grass of their training grounds. He felt a bit guilty for allowing her to train, especially after witnessing how much trouble she'd had simply walking. To his relief, Tenten's eyes slowly slid open, squinting lightly to block out the sunlight hitting her square in the face. She quickly pushed herself up into a sitting position, holding her head lightly in her hands. NNGH. What happened? Before either of them could open their mouths to speak, she slammed her hands over her own mouth in an attempt to stem the torrent of vomit threatening to spew out of the orifice. Needless to say, the effort was futile. She managed to turn her head just in time to avoid barfing all over herself, erupting all over the grass at her side. She struggled to breathe as wave after wave of vomit came up from her stomach in a never-ending flow, sending all 3 of her teammates into hysterics. Tenten, what's wrong? Is it heat exhaustion? Yes, that must be it. Or maybe, you ate something bad. It could also be that, Guy's tirade was interrupted by another loud gag from his student's mouth as she pumped more and more puke onto the ground, greatly enlarging the puddle of stomach fluid already there. Neji awkwardly rubbed her back, feeling extremely useless as she emptied her guts all over the training field. Finally, after literally 2 minutes of non-stop retching, she kneeled limply over the pile of vomit that she'd created. Her breaths were deep as she struggled to regain some much-needed air, and her stomach continuously spasmed from the massive amounts of regurgitation it had endured. Sensing that she was done, at least for now, Neji hurriedly helped her onto her feet, tossing one of her arms over her shoulder. "I'm taking you to the hospital, now." Tenten slowly shook her head, removing her arm from around his shoulders and taking a few shaky steps back to the other side of the field. "No, I'm okay now, really. I feel much better. Let's keep going." The way her voice wavered greatly contradicted her statement, and even Guy put on a frown at her obvious bluff. "Tenten, you're going to the hospital right now, even if we have to take you by force," the man threatened in an uncharacteristic show of seriousness. She hung her head in defeat, sighing deeply as she realized that there was no way out. Unfortunately, her pride refused to go down without a fight. "Fine, but you have to leave immediately after we get there. I don't want to be the one cutting into everyone else's training time." All three of her teammates frowned at the condition, but nodded their heads regardless. With that, Guy hefted the girl up onto his back and sped off towards Konoha General Hospital, the remaining two males close behind. Nervousness didn't begin to describe what she was feeling at that moment. Sitting all alone in the personal office of the Hokage's first apprentice, Shizune, proved to be one of the most nerve-wracking experiences in her life. Deciding to take her mind off of the situation, she moved her eyes over the many pictures and wall scrolls hanging in the small room. Most of the pictures on the wall were paintings, ranging from a copy of the Mona Lisa to a simple cliché bowl of fruit. Looking a bit closer, she noticed that there was a similar signature in each one. Her eyes widened when she realized that the name was Sai. Now that she thought about it, it did make some sense. The supposedly emotionless boy had been hanging around the older woman a lot lately, and Tenten was starting to understand why. She turned her attention to the photographs on the desk, desperately wanting to get off of that train of thought. The first picture was of a young Shizune, Tsunade, and Tenten at some strange casino. The Hokage was frowning deeply at a nervous-looking Shizune for some reason, and the Junin found herself wondering what exactly was going on when the picture was taken. The second picture was of her and Kakashi. His hand was resting playfully on top of her head as he smiled that familiar one-eyed smile at the camera, while an extremely red-faced Shizune smiled along with him. Tenten's eyebrows arched in surprise. Either Kakashi had said something embarrassing right before the picture was taken, or the medic Nin had a thing for the older shinobi. The third and final picture was one she'd seen many times on the Godime's desk. It included a pervertedly grinning Jiraiya, smiling Tsunade and Shizune, Tenten, and of course, a widely smiling Naruto. She frowned deeply at the picture of the blonde, sticking her tongue out at him for good measure. It was really starting to become annoying seeing him everywhere. "Tenten-san, are you Rita? What are you doing?" Shizune asked, eyebrows raised in surprise. The Junin jumped and turned to the medic Nin with wide eyes. She hadn't even sensed her. "Oh, I was, well, there was broccoli stuck in my teeth from lunch, and I was trying to see my reflection in the picture frame?" Tenten fidgeted under Shizune's disbelieving gaze, diverting her eyes to her lap in embarrassment. The older woman smirked and pulled her chair from behind her desk, moving it so that it was directly in front of the younger Kunoichi. "Well, I suppose you have your reasons." She grabbed a small folder off of the desk and pulled out what looked to be some kind of medical form, scribbling a few things onto the piece of paper. "From what your teammates have told me, you aren't feeling too well. Correct?" Glad to have a change of subject, Tenten slightly nodded her head. "Yes, but it's nothing serious, probably just a cold or something. There's really no need to be here." Shizune shook her head, looking up from the piece of paper long enough to look the girl in the eye. "Colds don't cause excessive vomiting." Tenten winced at the statement. She was hoping her teammates wouldn't tell her about that. "Now, in order for me to figure out what's wrong with you, I'm going to need to ask you a series of questions. Please answer truthfully, okay?" The girl nodded and took a deep breath. She wasn't very fond of doctors, to be honest, and only went when it was absolutely necessary. As in, when she was forced by either her teammates or another friend. "Okay, I'm ready. How long have you been feeling ill?" "I guess around 3 or 4 days. Have you experienced symptoms like this before?" "Once, when I had a fever during my last year at the academy." "What was done about it last time?" "I just took a few days off." Shizune nodded and quickly wrote the answers down. "What are your symptoms?" Tenten tilted her head slightly and thought. Well, other than vomiting, fatigue, soreness, and a little bit of dizziness. I'm sure it'll go away soon, though. Does it come or go, or is it constant? The dizziness and vomiting comes and goes, but the other stuff I feel all the time. Does it affect your feelings, home life, or work life? If so, how much? Sort of. I never feel like doing anything, so it affects it a lot. What parts of the body does the soreness affect? All over, but mostly in my chest. The medic nin glanced up for a second, giving the younger kunoichi a funny look. Really? That's interesting. Do you take any medications, supplements, or herbal remedies? No, but I took an aspirin last night to get rid of my headache. Have you ever, or do you currently smoke? How often and how much alcohol do you drink? Do you or have you ever taken any recreational drugs? Tenten blinked at the questions. Was she trying to imply something? Noticing her skeptical expression, Shizune quickly leaned forward and gave the girl a comforting pat on the shoulder. These are all formalities. We have to ask these questions to everyone. Oh, well, I've never smoked, but I drink a little alcohol every now and then. I usually don't drink more than a bottle, though I've had 5 or 6 on one occasion. And, no, I don't use drugs. Have you had any pregnancies? What? No. Shizune smirked at her horror-stricken face. It was always amusing seeing the reactions of the patients she interviewed. I didn't think so. We're almost done, just a few more to go. Are you ally active? Do you have more than one UAL partner? If she thought Tenten's face was funny before, her current expression was hilarious. This is completely confidential, by the way. Only myself and the Hokage will see these files. That relieved her a bit, and she swallowed the lump that had formed in her throat. Well, I'm not ally active, but I did have once almost 2 months ago. And I've only had one partner. Are any of your UAL partners of the same? Did you use any method of protection? No, it was a guy, and her face suddenly turned a deathly pale as she realized something horrible. It couldn't be that. And, no, we didn't use protection. It took every ounce of Shizune's willpower and medical training not to stare at the kunoichi in shock. I see. Well, then, those are all the questions I have for you. I think I've figured out what's wrong with you, but I'd like to run a few tests just to be sure. Please follow me. The medic nin stiffly stood up and walked out of the room, followed by an equally stiff Tenten. Luckily, the hallway was virtually empty except for a couple of chattering nurses, and the trip to the machinery lab was relatively uneventful. At least, on the outside. On the inside, the Junin was an emotional wreck. Her mind was flooded with all kinds of possibilities, and she fought to keep her composure as they made the short trek down the hallway. She clenched and unclenched her fingers, and a small sweat began to break out on her forehead. It couldn't be. Here we are, Shizune called, holding the door open for the girl. Tenten quickly entered the room and took a look around. It was much larger than the office she'd been in previously, and all kinds of different machines littered the white-walled room. The medic nin led her over to a relatively secluded corner, and pulling the curtain, turned to the Junin with a small smile. Please go into the door on your left and empty your bladder, if you can. Still too shocked to argue, she opened the door and entered the small bathroom. It didn't take long for her to relieve herself, as all the nervousness was really starting to catch up to her. She exited the room and nodded to the older woman. I'm finished. Good. Please remove your pants and underwear and lie down on the examining table. Tenten stiffly nodded again, doing as she asked in a slow and careful manner. Her entire body felt numb with fear, and an odd sinking feeling began to settle in her stomach. What is this? She asked, trying to make conversation. It often helped to relieve nervousness, as she'd found out during one of her many A-ranked missions. Shizune smiled gently and began to prepare something the younger girl couldn't see. This is what's called a transvaginal ultrasound. It sends out high-frequency sound waves that allow us to see everything inside of you. Now, this won't hurt, but you may feel some mild discomfort throughout this test. It'll take around half an hour, so in the meantime, would you like a magazine? Tenten slowly shook her head, feeling her heart rate begin to speed up with each passing second. There was no way she'd be able to concentrate on anything in her current state. And no, I'm fine. Alright then, I'll be starting now. Shizune gently inserted the mechanical probe into Tenten, wincing at the obviously pained expression on the girl's face. Don't worry, it'll be over before you know it. After making sure it was all the way in, She turned to the machine and began to press and turn the buttons littering the bulky console. The device whirred to live, startling the younger Junin once again. Is it on? Shizune smiled down at her and nodded before turning back to the machine. Yes. Just relax as best you can, though I know it's probably not what you want to hear at the moment. Tenten stared up at the ceiling in deep thought, doing her best to calm down. She was probably just overreacting. Yes, that had to be it. There was no possible way that. A brief shudder went through her at the thought. Maybe it'd be best if she got her mind off of that particular train of thought. So, she started, swallowing noisily over the beeping and whirring of the machine. I haven't seen Sakura around here today. Is she off? The black-haired woman turned away from the machine, considering the girl's question. Well, yes and no. She's working today, but Hokage-sama allowed her to take an extra long lunch break so that she could spend some time with Sasuke. Shizune's face noticeably fell at the mention of the raven-haired teenager. I feel bad for Naruto-kun, but I can't really blame Sakura-san for turning him down. You love who you love, right? Tenten turned her gaze back to the simple white ceiling. I wouldn't know. Shizune raised her eyebrows slightly, curious as to the bitter expression marring the young Junin's face. Is something bothering you? You can talk to me about it, if you'd like. As I said before, everything that happens in this building will remain strictly confidential. If it's a personal problem, I can keep it just between us. A loud sigh erupted from Tenten's mouth at the proposition. Shizune seemed to be a relatively trustworthy person, and she'd probably dealt with all kinds of people over the years. What did she have to lose? Taking a deep breath, she turned her head to look at the older woman. I'm scared. A small smile appeared on the medic Nin's face, and she reached over to lightly grip Tenten's calloused hand. Don't be. Remember, this is just a formality. Nothing has been decided yet. The Junin nodded her head, turning to stare back up the ceiling. How much longer? Around 5 minutes. You're doing great. By now, Tenten's heart was thumping powerfully against her ribcage, and she briefly wondered if she'd have a heart attack before she even received the news. The Junin exams had nothing on her current predicament, and that was saying something. Her fingers idly tapped against the paper-covered surface of the table, mentally counting down the seconds until she was done. Just when she thought that she couldn't take it anymore, Shizune turned around and removed the small probe from her vagina. All done. It'll only take a few more seconds to print out the sonogram, so you can put your pants back on in the meantime. Feeling oddly cold, she quickly snatched her clothing from the small basket next to the bed and pulled them on. Unfortunately, it did little to warm her up. She fidgeted nervously from her spot next to the table, biting her lip and cracking her knuckles to calm herself down. Didn't she say it'd only take a few seconds? The sound of the printer cranking up interrupted her thoughts, and she eagerly watched as the doctor grabbed a letter-sized piece of black paper from the machine. What does it say? She practically yelled, eyes studying the medic Nin's face for any sign of a hint. Shizune slowly looked up from the page, meeting Tenten's fearful eyes. You're pregnant. Tenten stared in absolute disbelief at Shizune, eyes wide and body limp from the sudden information. The medic Nin slowly nodded her head, and shortly after, the Junin collapsed onto the floor. Tenten-san, she yelled, kneeling down next to her. Tenten-san, get a hold of yourself. She quickly stretched the woman out until she was lying completely horizontal, biting her lip in mild worry. She then checked Tenten's pulse, and feeling the strong throbbing against her fingertips, she deduced that the Junin had fainted. Not that I can blame her, she muttered to herself. Shizune turned the younger Kunoichi's head to the side and placed her folded jacket underneath her legs to elevate them, marginally increasing blood flow to the brain. She formed a few seals and pumped a small amount of chakra into her left hand, placing it gently on Tenten's forehead. 2 seconds later, her eyes fluttered open to stare up at the medic Nin. She blinked a few times in surprise and tried to sit up, but a strong hand against her chest held her down. You shouldn't get up right away, you'll only faint again. Tenten sighed and nodded as best she could from her position. I don't suppose me being pregnant was a dream, then? When Shizune shook her head, she sighed again and turned to look up at the ceiling. I didn't think so. Although I know that this is probably the last thing you want to think about, we should really discuss what you're going to do next. The Junin shifted her eyes to look at the older woman. What I'm going to do next? Yes. You need to decide whether or not you're going to have the baby, or if you're going to abort it. Tenten noticeably stiffened at the proposition. Abort the baby? While it was true that she definitely didn't want to have any kids at this point in time, the fact of the matter was that the human growing inside of her belly was hers. Hers, and, do you know who the father is? Her face scrunched up in what looked like pain, immediately alarming the already worried medic Nin. It was part of her job to offer counseling and support for her patients, but she'd never been good at offering advice when it came to relationships. Yes, I know who he is. Shizune let loose a small breath of relief. At least Tenten wouldn't have to go through this situation alone. That's good. You should talk to him, and you two can make a decision together as to what to do with the baby together. Even better, you can bring him here when you come for your next checkup. A sickeningly evil grin appeared on the Junin's face, putting the Hokage's apprentice on edge. She'd seen that look before, more often than not on her mentor. No, that won't be necessary. Excuse me? Shizune asked, blinking a little in surprise. He won't be alive long enough to say anything. The eerie calm with which she spoke caused a brief shudder to go through the black-haired medic Nin, and she mentally began to pray for the poor soul who'd knocked her up. If he was lucky, he'd escape with his baby-making equipment intact. Tenten slowly got to her feet and began to leave the room, catching Shizune off guard. Tenten-san, please wait, we still need to talk about what you're going to do. The Junin stopped in the doorway, shooting an angry glare over her shoulder. We can talk later. If you'll excuse me, I have a certain blonde's head to bash in. With that, she disappeared from the room, leaving a confused Shizune in her wake. Blonde? Where the hell is he? Tenten hissed, stalking down the sidewalk of the market district for the second time that day. With her fingers clenched and face fixed into a frown, civilians and shinobi alike made sure to stay out of the Junin's way. One didn't piss off Konoha's weapons mistress without losing a finger or 10. She'd checked all of his usual haunts at least twice since she'd left the hospital: Ichiraku Ramen, the shinobi surplus store, the Hokage Tower, his apartment, Sakura's apartment, the Uchiha district, and even Team 7's old training grounds. Oddly enough, Naruto was nowhere to be found, something she found quite ironic considering she hadn't been able to avoid him for the past month and a half. Feeling a bit woozy from all of the exercise, she quickly looked for a place to cool down and get out of the hot summer sun. Konoha was famous for its extreme heat waves, with temperatures comparing to those of Suna in the summertime, a fact that positively astounded her. Her eyes scanned the area around her, a weary hand shielding her orbs from the blinding sunlight. She smiled as she spotted the Konoha Central Park in the distance, and remembering the especially large trees they had inside, she quickened her pace until she was safely inside of the huge enclosure. Once inside, Tenten wasted no time in finding the closest bench and plopping down onto it, Screw being prim and ladylike. After seating herself, she once again set about thinking of places the idiot blonde could be. Was he on a mission? Visiting friends in another village? Dead? She was beginning to get a headache from thinking so hard, and the loud, boisterous laughter of some asshole nearby wasn't helping any. The Junin blinked in surprise when she realized that the man's laughter sounded oddly familiar. Almost like. Tenten jumped to her feet and practically ran towards the voice, ignoring the queasy feeling in the bottom of her stomach from getting up so fast. As she pushed her way through a particularly thick bush, her eyes landed on the park's large and colorful jungle gym. Nearly a dozen kids were playing around and in the contraption, and spotting a particularly bright tuft of blonde hair, she felt a positively evil smirk spread across her face. Found you, she seethed, her smirk growing into a deadly smile. Just watching Naruto play with the children so carelessly made her angry. While she was pregnant, tired, and stressed out, he was off entertaining a bunch of 4- and 5-year-olds. The way he could so easily make friends with anyone was another thing that pissed her the fuck off. Balling her fists at her sides, she fully intended to give him a piece of her mind, already anticipating how much pain she would put him through. Much to her chagrin, however, she found that she couldn't move. As much as she wanted to cut his heart out with a spoon, and as much as she wanted to rip off his penis and use it to rape him up the ass, she couldn't. Whether he intended to or not, the bastard had warmed her heart. Watching him run around and laugh like a child touched something inside of her. It made her feel as though things would be alright, and that together, they could get through this. In fact, now that she thought about it, Naruto had always been the supportive and caring type. What the hell was she worried about? Her smile widening a bit, she lifted a hand to her mouth. "Naruto," she called, using her other hand to wave him over. Both the blonde and the kids turned around to look at her with curious expressions, but Naruto's face immediately turned into a frown. Sticking his tongue out, he used his middle finger to pull on his lower eyelid, causing all of the children around him to laugh. Tenten's face noticeably fell at his reaction, slightly alarming the young man. He was expecting her to storm over to yell at him some more, not actually be insulted by the childish action. After staring for a few more seconds, he slowly bent down until he was eye level with all of the children. "Hey, I'm gonna go talk to the mean old lady for a little bit. You guys stay here." A loud chorus of "AWWWS" reached his ears, bringing a wide grin to his face. It was times like these that he wished he had a child of his own. Standing once more, Naruto waltzed over to his fellow Junin with an agitated glare, shoving his hands deep into his pockets as he approached. "What do you want?" he sneered, narrowing his eyes for added effect. Rather than go off on him like she'd initially planned, Tenten suddenly found herself frightened of what his reaction would be. Would he be happy? Sad? Angry? Would he yell at her? She nervously bit her lip, less sure of herself by the second. It didn't help that 24 pairs of eyes were staring at her. "Can we go somewhere else to talk?" she practically whispered, eyes dropping to the ground. Naruto blinked. What the hell kind of reaction was that to his taunt? Now he knew something was wrong, and somehow, it involved himself. The very beginnings of fear slowly began to seep into his heart, and nodding dumbly, he followed her to a fairly secluded park bench located a few dozen yards away from the jungle gym. No sooner had they sat down did the blonde start shooting questions at her, his brows furrowing in concern. "What's wrong? Is it something I did? Is there something I can do to help?" Tenten almost laughed at the irony. Almost. She lowered her head and stared down at her feet, idly wiggling her toes as she attempted to piece together what she wanted to say. Her perfectly planned speech had been completely forgotten, and she found it hard to even come up with a single word to say to him. After spending a few seconds collecting her thoughts, she raised her eyes to meet the Jinchuriki's, morbidly pleased to see that he was just as afraid as she was. "Naruto, we." Annoyingly, her words caught in her throat. Looking into his bright blue eyes had somehow sapped what little confidence she'd had. Refusing to give up, she averted her gaze and took a deep breath, letting it out slowly through clenched teeth. "I'm pregnant." The silence was deafening. She was far too afraid to see his reaction, if he even had one. As quiet as it was possible that he'd had a heart attack and died right after she'd relayed the news. Finally, after a few minutes of uninterrupted silence, Naruto asked the one question she never thought she'd hear in her life. "Are you saying it's mine?" Every nerve in her body was demanding that she strangle him with his own spinal cord right there on the spot. How dare he ask her such a loaded and frivolous question? Men were only supposed to ask that question on television and in movies, not in real life. It amazed her that he even had the guts. She figured that her expression must have been awfully frightening, as Naruto was quick to add on to his original inquiry. "I mean, we only did it once, and that was an accident. There's no way you got pregnant after that one time." For a moment, she didn't know whether to kill him or pity him. Obviously, someone had failed Ed at the academy. Tenten sighed tiredly and rubbed a hand over her eyes, fighting to keep her more violent emotions in check. "It only takes once, Naruto. Just once. But, just once. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. Not with you." A grim smile appearing on her face, the weapons mistress was quick to reply. "You weren't exactly my first choice either." The blonde stared down at his hands, a look of absolute disbelief plastered on his normally grinning face. It almost pained her to see him so distressed, but in a way, she was happy to see him panicking over the information. It meant that he was beginning to accept the fact that the baby growing inside of her was his too, and feeling relieved that she wasn't in this alone anymore, she took another deep breath and raised her head to look at him. "So, what are we going to?" At that moment, Naruto hopped to his feet, his eyes looking everywhere but at her. "I am sorry. I had to go." He quickly began to walk away from her, heading down the path that led to the residential district. Surprised, Tenten quickly began to follow. "Wait, we still have to talk about what we're going to." Her voice trailed off as she watched the familiar movement of his arms performing hand seals, and a moment later, he disappeared in a golden flash. Tears began to prickle at the back of her eyeballs as for the first time since she'd arrived at the hospital, she felt alone. Her knees suddenly felt weak, and she slowly lowered herself until she was sitting flat on her butt, her legs splayed out awkwardly in front of her. Out of all the scenarios she'd come up with in her mind, this one hadn't even occurred to her. Never in a million years would she have thought Naruto would abandon her when she needed him most. This was the same boy who fought Orochimaru twice when he was only a genin. This was the same boy who defeated and transformed a former psychopath into the case cage of the Sand Village. This was the same boy who killed Orochimaru and dragged a critically injured Sasuke back to the village. It wasn't possible, not with Naruto. A choked sob escaped her throat, but she quickly fought down the urge to cry. She was stronger than this. If he didn't want to help her make a decision, then fine, she'd do it by herself. It wasn't like her to rely on the help of someone else, anyway. She'd been on her own ever since she'd entered the academy, and had handled dozens of trials and tribulations alone for as long as she could remember. She could get through this was nothing. She didn't need him, she didn't need anyone. With that thought in mind, she slowly pushed herself onto her feet, forcing her cowardly knees to support her weight. After making sure that she could walk without risk of falling, she steadily headed towards the exit leading to the residential district. The first thing she needed to do was take a nap. She was exhausted from the emotional roller coaster she'd been on since morning. She could make her decision when she woke up. So, you ran. Nice. Uchiha Sasuke sipped at his cup of tea with a detached sense of concern, eyes closing in obvious annoyance as he drank. He'd been more than a little peeved when his best friend and second worst enemy Uzumaki Naruto had shown up on his doorstep at 2:30 in the morning. Then again, anyone would be. Sighing deeply, he pulled his dark blue robe closer around himself, looking back up at the distressed blonde with a tired frown. Well, what are you going to do? I don't know. That's why I came to you. The raven-haired Chunin lifted a curious eyebrow, obviously put off by the statement. You act like I've gotten a girl pregnant after a night of wild, drunken before. How would I know? Naruto winced at his friend's words. If there was one thing he could say about his rival, it was that he never minced his words. The young man ran a tired hand through his unruly locks, letting loose an exasperated breath of air. You had to be able to help me out somehow. What would you do in my situation? Naruto, you know full well that I'm not going to answer that question. Slamming his fist onto the table, and putting a sizable crack into it as he did so, he leaned over the thick wooden piece of furniture to glare straight into the Uchiha's eyes. God damn it, this is all your fault. If you hadn't stolen Sakura-chan from me in the first place, I never would have met Tenten, gotten drunk, and made her pregnant. This is your fault, so you had to help me. Sasuke stared boredly into Naruto's eyes for a few more seconds before lowering them to stare at the crack the Chunin had made in the table. That was an antique. I expect compensation. Fed up, Naruto grabbed the table and flipped it over, screaming all the while. Porcelain dishes flew everywhere as he went on a rampage, kicking, stomping, and throwing whatever he could get his hands on. After nearly 5 minutes of non-stop yelling and fury, he finally calmed down enough to catch his breath. Are you done? The Chunin asked, resting his teacup and saucer in his lap after taking another sip. The room was literally a disaster area, with paper, books, broken dishes, and splinters of wood strewn about. Naruto growled lowly at his best friend, shooting him as evil of a glare as he could manage. Sasuke. He snarled, still panting from his earlier exertion, I'm not playing around. I need your help. Do you? I seem to remember a certain annoying idiot who always used to say, I won't run away. I never go back on my word, because that's my nindo. My ninja way. Naruto frowned deeply, more than a little peeved that he'd quoted his personal nindo word for word. This is different. This has nothing to do with being a ninja. It doesn't? Aren't you a shinobi? Isn't she? The blonde's face noticeably fell as he struggled to come up with a suitable comeback. Yeah, but there are no buts. You know what you had to do. Naruto stared down at his feet, hair shielding his eyes from view. Sure, he had a pretty good idea of what to do, but he still wasn't sure. It was easy to make a decision, but what if I make the wrong decision? Then what? That's never stopped you before. Just handle it how you handle everything else and it'll work out. The Jinchuriki smiled for the first time that morning, a resolute look in his cerulean blue eyes. Now that he thought about it, it made a whole of sense. He'd made the baby, so it's only natural that he'd take care of it. Right? Thanks, Sasuke. His friend grunted a reply, taking another gulp from his half-finished teacup. Don't thank me until you see how much I'm going to charge you for wrecking my dining room. Anticipate a letter within 2 weeks detailing how much you owe me. Glancing around, Naruto grinned sheepishly at the mess he'd made of Sasuke's home. You could barely see the floor because of all the broken glass and wood covering the ground, and without seeing how the room looked before, it was nearly impossible to tell that it was a dining room in the first place. I guess this means I don't have a chance with Sakura-chan anymore, huh? He mumbled, reaching for any sliver of humor he could find. The Chunin grunted and stood up, placing his teacup on the nearby counter. You never had a chance in the first place. Naruto scrunched his face up in disdain. Bastard, dumbass, emo bitch, ramen slut, snakefucker, furfag. At the last insult, the blonde's mouth hung open. It was unfair to use the appearance of his four tails state against him. Hey, that was below the belt. The first hint of a smile appeared on Sasuke's face, and he quickly turned around to hide his grin. You started it. Thunk, thunk, thunk. The steady sound of kunai hitting her practice dummy filled the apartment. Her face the picture of apathy, Tenten effortlessly threw her entire kunai collection towards the poor wooden mannequin, aiming more towards the head than anywhere else. She'd somehow managed to get a hold of a large enough picture of Naruto's grinning face, thankful for the life-sized poster she'd received from him on her last birthday. Dark rings permeated the area below her brown eyes, and though she couldn't see it, she knew her hair was a mess. Despite her confident thoughts the day before, she hadn't been able to sleep a wink. She'd been up all night worrying about what she should do with the baby. Although she'd rather not have an abortion, it seemed to be the only viable option at the current point in time. It was nearly impossible for a single shinobi mother to raise a child on her own. She needed to go on missions to make money, and she was barely able to support herself. Granted, she'd only been taking B-ranked missions lately, but that was besides the point. She couldn't even imagine leaving her child alone or in the hands of strangers so often, and if she was going to be a mother, she wanted to do it right. She flicked another kunai at the dummy's head, frowning when it just missed Naruto's eyeball. Her eyes were beginning to grow bleary from lack of sleep, making it increasingly difficult for her to aim properly. Normally, staying up for 24 hours straight wasn't so bad. She'd done it plenty of times on stakeout and recon missions, holding her position until someone else arrived to take over for her. However, after the stressful day she'd had, 24 hours seemed like hell. The worst part of this whole ordeal was that she couldn't drink, and God could she use a shot of Everclear right about now. A quiet knock at her front door quickly threw her into a full state of consciousness, and with a small grunt, she pushed herself onto her feet to answer the door. A fleeting glance at her bedside clock showed the time to be 5 in the morning. An ungodly hour no matter who you were. Except for Guy and Lee, anyway. Tenten slowly trudged towards the door, wincing at the popping sounds emanating from her joints. It was only natural considering the fact that she hadn't moved from her position in over 5 hours. Yawning widely, she reached her hand out towards the door to unlatch the lock before gripping the doorknob and opening the large slab of wood. What? She asked, eyes red and slitted from lack of sleep. They quickly widened to the size of silver dollars as she realized who the person staring up at her sheepishly was. You. As if by magic, an oversized kunai appeared in her left hand, immediately sending her guest into a panic. It was bad enough that she'd look like a zombie when she answered the door. Now, she looked like a zombie with a big-ass kunai in her hand. Wait, just listen, give me 5 minutes, Naruto yelled, raising his hands in a placating manner. He was currently kneeling down in front of her on his knees, assuming what he hoped to be an apologetic stance. Tenten stared down at him with a positively evil expression, feeling her blood begin to boil at the gall of her fellow Junin. After knocking her up, accusing her of sleeping around, and running away when she needed his help, did he really think he could get away without experiencing some form of excruciating pain? That she'd instantly forgive him for abandoning her not even 12 hours before? Yeah, not fucking likely. She lifted the blade higher above her head, fully intending to slice off a finger or 10. She wasn't too worried about killing him. The Kyuubi healed everything within a reasonable time frame, and if he could survive a Chidori to the chest, then he could survive having a few appendages chopped off at the joint. Her eye twitched when the blonde placed his forehead against the ground, fully showing his submission to her. Please. 5 minutes, that's all I need. Just 5 minutes. Annoyingly, she felt her grip on the handle of the kunai lessen. She hated that he could do that to her. Make her feel guilty for wanting to cause him pain, even if he fully deserved it. Tenten ground her teeth against each other, debating in her mind what to do. 5 seconds, she growled, bringing the weapon down to her side. Naruto's head snapped up in relief, and wasting no time, he jumped to his feet. I'm really sorry. When you said you were pregnant I panicked and ran because I didn't know what to do and I went to talk to Sasuke and he helped me and stuff but I still wasn't sure so I went to the top of the Hokage mountain to think some more and I finally realized that leaving you behind was wrong and that I should have stayed with you until we decided what to do but I'm here now and I hope you can forgive me and I'm definitely here for you and the baby so no matter what you want to do I'll always support you just ask and I'll do anything so ple. 5 seconds are up, Tenten said, cutting him off before he could finish. Amazingly enough, she could actually follow what he was saying, a sure sign that she needed to get to sleep, and fast. She stared into his deep blue eyes with the deepest disdain, angry that she no longer felt the overwhelming urge to stab him multiple times in the ballsack. The kunai in her hand dropped to the ground, clanging loudly against her hardwood floor. So, does that mean you forgive me? He asked, eyes wide and hopeful. The woman idly wondered how a 17-year-old Junin could make himself look like a 5-year-old academy student without even trying. Still, he wasn't going to get off that easily. No. However, I'm willing to let you keep your word. You'll do whatever I say whenever I say it. Got it? Naruto's face noticeably paled at the proposal. He'd seen enough daytime television to know how this would turn out. Well, but, didn't you say you'd do anything? Yeah, but, isn't your nindo to never go back on your word? The blonde cursed under his breath. That was the second time someone had used his own words against him within the last 24 hours. Deciding he needed an extra push, Tenten added in another condition to help him decide. Or maybe you'd rather I relieve my frustration by making you sterile? Fine, I've got it. I'll do whatever you say. The woman fought to keep a smirk from spreading across her face. Sure, she was still pregnant, but she'd always wanted a personal slave. And what better person to enslave than Naruto? He could travel from one side of the village to the other in under a minute, a useful skill, if she didn't say so herself. Good, come in, it's time to start keeping your word. His face turning a shade paler, the blonde followed her into the apartment, already dreading what she would have him do first. For today, I'll have you do some light chores. Wash the dishes, clean the bathrooms, take out the trash, and sweep the floors. Naruto's mouth opened in shock. She could consider all that light? As if suddenly remembering something, the Junin stopped in the middle of the hallway. Oh, by the way, you can forget ever having again. Nani? Biting her fingernails, Tenten slowly trudged down the street of the residential district. She wasn't looking forward to this. Not at all. She felt sicker and sicker with each shaky step, but she fought to keep moving forward. It had to be done, she'd put it off long enough. Tenten. Oi, Tenten, hold up. An annoyingly familiar voice called from behind her. With a loud groan, the girl turned around to greet the blonde running full speed in her direction. You forgot your lunch. Her eyebrows raised in slight surprise as she noticed the carefully wrapped bento box hanging from his outstretched hand. Despite all of his grumbling and complaining, Naruto had proven to be an extremely reliable and compassionate person. After her initial command that he become her bitch, he'd literally, but grudgingly, done everything she had asked of him over the past 3 weeks. Whether it was ironing her clothes, drawing her bath, or making her a peanut butter and pickle sandwich at 2 in the fucking morning, he did it with relatively little fuss. At least compared to the first couple of days, she'd only had to remind him once why she was dubbed the weapons mistress of Konoha. Oh, thanks, she mumbled, grabbing the kerchief-wrapped box from his hand. While she was oddly touched by the gesture, it also unnerved her a bit. He was acting a little too much like a mother. Or, at least, what she thought a mother would be like. How did you manage to make me a lunch and catch up to me in under 10 minutes, anyway? You were drooling all over yourself when I left. Sheepishly scratching the back of his head, the boxer-clad Junin shrugged his shoulders. Well, after all the peanut butter and pickle sandwiches I've made you lately, my hands were pretty much working on muscle memory. In a way, it's kind of like learning a new jutsu. Shortly after saying that, He suddenly flashed through a bunch of seals, most of which she'd never seen before. She tilted her head curiously as she watched his face, noting the determined frown growing deeper and deeper with each passing second. "Peanut butter and pickle sandwich no jutsu," he shouted, hands stopping on the tiger seal. Tenten waited with wide eyes for something to happen, her mouth opening slightly in anticipation. Had he really come up with a technique that could make an instant sandwich? Was that even possible? At that moment, her common sense punched her in the uterus, and her face dropped into a deadpan expression. Leaning forward, she smacked him on the side of the head with what she hoped was an angry pout. "You're an idiot," she muttered, unable to keep a smile from flickering onto her face. Naruto shrugged again, a grin of his own appearing in place of his frown. "It made you smile, didn't it?" Lifting a hand to her lips, she realized that she was, indeed, smiling, rather widely at that. She opened her mouth to say something else, but noticed with a small amount of surprise that he was already halfway down the sidewalk, his hands tucked neatly behind his head. It was then that she noticed he wasn't wearing pants, or shoes, or anything other than a pair of orange and black boxer shorts. How the fuck had she missed that? Shaking her head in exasperation, she once again turned to continue her journey, in considerably higher spirits than she had been only 10 minutes before. What she was about to do would be one of the toughest things she'd ever had to go through in her life, but suddenly, she felt as though everything would be alright. Naruto would still be there, at least, he said he would. Even if they weren't in love, or necessarily friends for that matter, she had to admit that he was a pretty alright guy once given half a chance. It was almost hard to believe that they'd been at each other's throats less than a month before. He was a lot more considerate than most people gave him credit for, and although he was annoying when he was around, she found that she somewhat missed his cheerful exuberance when he wasn't. Only because she didn't have any friends to talk to about her situation. At least, none who would take the news as gracefully as Naruto had. Staring up at the tall gates of the Hyuga mansion, only one thought permeated throughout her mind. I'm so fucking screwed. If she thought being outside of the mansion was nerve-wracking, being inside was 1,000 times worse. The cold, unforgiving white walls of the building all seemed to be mocking her somehow. Don't ask how, they just were. Fuck you if you don't understand, you had to be there. Is everything alright, Tenten-san? A voice asked from in front of her, startling her out of her thoughts. She was immensely grateful that she'd had the foresight to not bring any unsealed weapons with her, as it was very likely that she would have impaled the Hyuga guard by accident for surprising her. Multiple times, with the sharpest and longest blades available in the fire country. The young woman shook her head, giving the white-eyed man a shaky smile. I'm fine, still a little tired, I guess. The man nodded his head as if understanding and continued on down the hallway, much to the relief of the weapons mistress. Had he been a more experienced Hyuga, he might have been able to pinpoint exactly what was wrong with her with only one glance. On second thought, maybe it was just that he really didn't give much of a fuck. In any case, she continued to follow the older man until they reached a large set of double doors. She was quite familiar with these doors, having spent the better part of 2 years behind them with her best friend. Or, soon-to-be ex-best friend. The guard bowed and quickly stepped away, almost as if he knew that shit was about to go down. Coward, she thought, watching his retreating back with the coldest glare she could manage. Even though she said that, she would have done the exact same thing if she was in his position, only she would have been running away at a much faster pace, and she wouldn't have stopped until she reached the outskirts of the village. Taking in a deep breath, she lifted a hand calloused by years of working with weapons to tap lightly on the door. Her eyes shifted once again to the guard walking away down the hall, and she idly wondered if it was in her best interest to do the same. She'd tangled with a Hyuga or two in her lifetime, and from personal experience, she could say that her chances of survival were about 50-50, if that. She was once again thrown out of her thoughts when the left side of the doors opened to reveal a young, pale-eyed girl with long brown hair. She looked up at the older woman with an impassive stare, but nonetheless turned to look back at whoever was left in the room. It's Tenten-san. A surprised gasp followed by the sounds of exaggerated bustling and cleaning wafted from the large room, leaving Tenten wondering what the hell they'd been doing before she had arrived. She quickly found her answer when she finally took a look at the younger Hyuga's face. Someone had applied a small amount of blush to both of the girl's cheeks, making her look much more alive than she usually did. A generous amount of ruby red lipstick adorned her lips, and her hair was pulled back into a loose ponytail to reveal her soft, girlish features. No doubt, this was Hinata's doing. "Well, don't you look cute?" Tenten exclaimed, glad to have something else to distract her from her current situation. "Did your Oni-chan help you with it?" The lithe girl only nodded, a ghost of a smile appearing on her lips. She then dipped her head towards the Junin and exited the room with barely contained excitement, leaving the woman wondering what exactly had the genin so anxious. "Tenten-chan, where have you been? I haven't seen you for over 3 weeks now," Hinata asked, suddenly appearing in the doorway. She wrapped her brown-haired friend in a tight hug, obviously happy to see the older girl. The weapons mistress smiled uneasily, awkwardly returning the gesture. "Yeah, you too. Actually, Hinata-chan, I something to tell. Did you see Hanabi-chan? Didn't she look adorable?" The Hyuga heir ushered her friend into the room, motioning for her to take a seat on the now-cleared bed. Sighing deeply, Tenten nodded her head and forced a smile onto her face. "Yeah, she did. What's the occasion?" A knowing glint appeared in Hinata's eye, one that she usually only saw in Sakura or Ino's eyes when they were passing on the latest village gossip. "You know the Sandame's grandson? Konohamaru-kun?" she asked, her eyes practically glowing with mischievousness. Tenten nodded again, almost rolling her eyes in exasperation. Who didn't know of the boy? He was practically a Naruto clone, and he'd pulled all, and then some, of the blonde's most classic pranks. Although she was ashamed to admit it, her favorite technique was by far the Oiro no Jutsu. Otoko no Kodushi no Jutsu. She didn't find Sai or Sasuke all that attractive alone, but together. No, now was not the time for this. She had more important things to worry about than whether or not she could get Naruto to imitate the jutsu for her whenever she pleased. "Well, it turns out Hanabi-chan has a thing for him. Isn't that cute?" Tenten nodded her head unenthusiastically, forcing another grin onto her face. "She's just like me when I was her age. It's kind of funny that we both like the same kind of guys, don't you think?" Yeah, funny. Hey, Hinata-chan, actually. What if we ended up having a double wedding? Hanabi-chan and Konohamaru-kun along with Naruto-kun and I." The Junin winced. Fuck, she'd been trying to tell her before she said something sappy like that. As if noticing her downcast expression, Hinata placed an embarrassed hand over her mouth, her cheeks turning an annoyingly cute shade of red. "Oh, I'm sorry, Tenten-chan. I got a little carried away with my own wayward fantasies. Didn't you have something to tell me?" If she didn't know any better, she'd say that Hinata was doing this on purpose. She heavily considered excusing herself right then and there to go home, but decided that nothing good could come of trying to hide the truth. She'd find out eventually, anyway, better to tell her now rather than later. Actually, Hinata-chan, well, you see, I'm sort of pregnant." Tenten squinched her eyes shut in relief, glad that she'd said it before she chickened out. She lifted one eyelid to gauge her friend's reaction, but was startled to see that the Hyuga's face was completely void of emotion. It was as if someone had literally sucked out that little corner of the brain that told normal people to look shocked in these sort of situations. Oh my god. Tenten-chan, congratulations. Hinata shrieked, hopping to her feet and scaring Tenten shitless. "When did you find out? How far along are you? I have to arrange a baby shower right away." For a few seconds, the brown-haired girl stared at the hysterical girl in absolute shock. She was cheering? Why? This was the complete opposite of what she'd been expecting. If anything, she expected Hinata to be screaming at her. How many girls would cheer when they just found out that their best friend was knocked up by? Oh, fuck. She'd forgotten to mention the part about Naruto being the one to impregnate her. Yeah, that was pretty important. Hinata-chan, please stop. The blue-haired girl glanced over her shoulder to look at Tenten in confusion. What? Why? As if realizing something, Hinata's eyes widened to the size of saucers, making the weapons mistress wonder if she'd finally figured it out. You're going to abort the baby? Okay, so she hadn't figured it out. Not that she expected her to, of course. Unfortunately, both girls had failed to realize that there was a third person listening in on their conversation. Said person had been casually walking towards the room, on his way to see if his dearest cousin wanted to get some early afternoon training in. Upon getting within 5 feet of the door, He'd heard an abundant amount of shrieking coming from inside. He couldn't catch most of what the shrieking person had said, but he'd the words, baby, and shower, quite clearly. It was a well-known fact to all that using the Byakugan indoors was strictly prohibited by all clan members, unless, of course, there was an extreme situation that called for it. So, unable to use his dujutsu, Neji decided to rely on his other ninja skills to eavesdrop, standing against the door in a way that wouldn't look overly suspicious in case someone decided to walk by while still being able to hear what was going on quite clearly. The Anbu officer blinked in surprise when he recognized the voice of his teammate and friend, Tenten. What was she doing here so early? Granted, she sometimes slept over at their home on the weekends, but he certainly would have noticed if she'd been there the night before. Nothing got past him. Nothing. Hinata-chan, you might want to take a seat. This is really important, and I need you to understand. Still believing that her friend was going to get an abortion, the blue-haired girl sat down on her bed in shocked silence, dumbly following the orders of the older girl. Once she was certain that Hinata was properly seated, she continued. I'm not getting an abortion. Relief visibly washed over her at the news, and she started to stand up once again. Oh, Tenten-chan, you had me war. Hinata, sit down. Puzzled by her seriousness, the Hyuga heir once again eased herself back down onto the bed. It was unusual for Tenten to drop the chan suffix from her name, so it must be serious. Although she didn't know what the problem was, she was confident that she could help her best friend get through it, no matter what the circumstances. Outside, Neji was furious. Who dared defile his teammate, and get her pregnant, no less? It had to be that bastard, Sai. He always did seem like the raping type, what with his fake smile and constant talk about penises. It wouldn't surprise him in the least if it was that emotionless son of a bitch. Still, he decided to make sure before he took action. No sense wasting energy beating up the wrong guy, although he'd like to kick Sai's creepy ass anyway. Tenten took a deep breath, briefly closing her eyes as she scrounged up the courage necessary to continue. When she'd first gotten knocked up, she hadn't even considered what Hinata's reaction would be. She'd only been worried about herself and kicking Naruto's ass, nothing more, nothing less. Why couldn't it be like that again? Why must life fuck with her every chance it got? She gripped the scroll in her pocket, feeling a bit of comfort from knowing that her collection of shields was locked away inside. If worse came to worse, she could summon her entire collection and make a clean getaway. She glanced out of the corners of her eyes to make sure she had a clear escape route, and a backup route, just in case one was cut off, before taking another deep breath and continuing. Hinata, the father of my baby is Naruto. Tenten sat on pins and needles, looking for any kind of sign that she should hightail it out of there. However, the girl sitting on the bed only looked at her with a blank expression. Her eyes were dazed and unfocused, and her arms hung limp at her sides. The sudden sound of giggling reached the older girl's ears, immediately setting her on edge. Out of all the reactions she'd pictured in her mind, she didn't think that Hinata would laugh. Oh, I get it. You're joking with me. I know you'd never betray me by doing something like this. You're my best friend, and one of the few people I'd trust wholeheartedly. You almost got me with that one. The girl's laughter increased in volume, causing Tenten to scoot closer to the edge of the bed. Oh shit. The bitch was crazy. Hinata-chan? Are you okay? Of course I'm okay. You know how much Naruto-kun means to me. You wouldn't do something like that, right? You're my best friend, right? Tenten slowly nodded her head, a sad frown on her face. It's true that I wouldn't normally do something like this, but we were drinking, and we started competing, then one thing led to another and… What are you talking about, Tenten-chan? Stop making this shit up. You wouldn't do this to me. You're my best friend. By now, tears were running in torrents down the pale-eyed girl's cheeks, splashing against the clenched fists resting in her lap. You're my best friend. Best friends don't this to each other, right? Right? You're right, but it was an accident. We were not even dating or anything like that. I don't even like the guy. I mean, he's staying at my place right now to help me out, but it's… Fuck, she probably shouldn't have mentioned that part. Fingering the scroll in her pocket, the weapons mistress quickly got to her feet, putting a sizable amount of distance between them. She'd seen this before, numerous times. It happened all the time on missions, where clients or the family of clients were unable to accept that a loved one had died. While she was used to dealing with the reactions of normal civilians, dealing with Hinata-chan was totally different. She could kill her if she got hysterical enough, and quite honestly, she had no intentions of dying anytime soon. Things outside the door weren't much better. Neji's face was frozen in shock. Out of all the people he'd thought of, Naruto literally hadn't even crossed his mind. His eyes narrowing in anger, he sharply turned in the opposite direction, heading full speed towards the entrance of the mansion. Even if he did consider the blonde one of his close friends, Tenten was even closer. He had to make sure the boy understood exactly what he'd gotten himself into by getting his teammate pregnant. AKA, he had to kick his ass. The guards watched in confusion as the Hyuga prodigy rushed past them like a gust of wind. His Byakugan already activated, he set about the tedious task of searching out his other teammate, Rock Lee. Partly because he deserved to be one of the first to know, but mostly because he'd need someone to hold him back in case he started to go too far. Naruto would regret the day he even looked at Tenten. Oh, would he regret it? Had he stayed to listen just a few seconds longer, he would have heard the scream of outrage that poured from Hinata's throat, and the accompanied shriek of fear that erupted from Tenten's. Her Byakugan blazing, the Hyuga literally flew from the bed with a palm outstretched, killing intent flowing through her veins and light blue chakras swirling around her body. For the first time since she'd become a part of Team Guy, Tenten was glad that she'd helped Neji train for all these years. Thinking quickly, she flipped backwards onto her hands, in the process kicking her former best friend's hand into the air. After lowering herself to her feet, she grabbed the scroll in her pocket and forced some chakra into the paper, summoning one of the smaller shields in her arsenal. Just in time, too, as Hinata's other hand connected quite solidly with the hard metal of the shield with enough force to put a small dent in it. "Hinata-chan, calm down, I'm sorry," Tenten yelled, edging towards the window. Seeing where she was going, the Hyuga heir was quick to cut her off, lunging for a third attack. This time, the blow glanced Tenten's bicep, causing the older girl to drop the shield to the ground. The thing was far too heavy to carry with only one arm, and that was one of the smaller ones. "Please, Hinata-chan, it was an accident. You know I'd never do this on purpose." Unfortunately, the smaller girl refused to listen to reason, and was already preparing her next attack. "I'll kill you. I'll fucking kill you and that little shit inside of you," Hinata screamed, pumping as much chakra as humanly possible into her hand. When she was certain she had enough to deal the final blow, she ran forward with the intent to kill. Luckily for Tenten, a swarm of guards burst through the door, forming a protective barrier in front of her. All 5 of the men simultaneously aimed towards her hand, and with a loud bang, they successfully cancelled out her attack. Soon after, 3 of the men grabbed and restrained her to prevent her from doing further damage. "Hinata-sama, please calm down," one of the guards yelled, struggling to maintain a grip on the viciously fighting girl's arm. "Let me go. I'll kill you, bitch. You fucking backstabbing bitch. I'll fucking slit your throat." A pang of pain pulsed through Tenten at her words, and she suddenly felt too weak to stand. She knew that this was a bad idea from the start, however, she didn't regret it. She couldn't. It was better to tell her now than let her find out from someone else. However, that didn't make it hurt any less. Hinata-chan, shut up. Shut the fuck up. I'll fucking stab you in your fat slutty stomach. You. At that moment, one of the guards had the decency to knock the girl out with a well-placed chop to the back of her neck. She collapsed into their arms shortly after, her face still furrowed in anger. Thank you," she mumbled, still staring at her former friend in awe. She didn't even think Hinata knew those words. The familiar feeling of someone watching her permeated her senses, and she turned to see a wide-eyed Hanabi staring at the scene with no small amount of shock. The girl's fingers were clenched roughly around the doorknob, and her eyes were wide with fear. "Hanabi-chan, get out," Hanabi said, her voice coming out as more of a whimper than anything. Tenten stared at the girl for a few seconds, unable to believe what she was hearing. First Hinata, and now Hanabi? Get out. This time, the girl screamed louder than anyone had ever heard her scream before, her face a light pink with exertion and anger. Fat tears rolled down her cheeks, but despite this, she still managed to shoot the Junin a murderous glare. Her head falling, Tenten slowly got to her feet and walked towards the open window, figuring it to be the quickest and safest way out of the compound. She glanced back at them one more time with a face full of pain and sorrow. "I'm sorry." With that, she disappeared through the window, never looking back even once as she ran towards home. Kage Bunshin no Jutsu. Arranging his fingers into the familiar cross sign that he used far too often, Uzumaki Naruto called forth enough chakra to produce 20 clones of himself, all of them surrounding him in a perfect circle. Each of them held a freshly sharpened kunai in their hands, and each of them were focused on the grinning blonde standing in the direct center of the group. A second later, they all disappeared in a flash of yellow. The clearing was filled with the sound of kunai clashing against each other, and the occasional pop wafted out from the storm of yellow and orange. Not even the Sharingan would be able to keep up with the speed they were moving as they used the freshly learned Hiraishin to zip and zoom around the field. Finally, after 10 straight minutes of this, a single Naruto stood triumphant. Or rather, he would be standing if he wasn't currently gasping for breath on his hands and knees. Just as he was about to get up, 2 dark shadows appeared over him, immediately putting him on guard. "Naruto," Neji said, his voice oddly cold. Still, the blonde was glad that it wasn't an enemy and instantly relaxed. "Oh, Neji, it's you. I know you guys are Anbu now, but it still isn't a good happen to teleport so close to an armed ninja like." A sudden kick to his jaw quickly shut him up, and he was sent flying 10 feet before he was able to gain enough of his bearings to spin himself onto his feet. The blow had hurt, and touching his now tender jaw, he correctly assessed that the kick had come from Lee. "What the fuck are you doing?" he yelled, eyes narrowing at the 2 men. Both of them wore eerily blank expressions, and while it wasn't uncommon to see the look on the older Hyuga's face, it was bone-chillingly scary to see it on the normally loud and exuberant mini guy. "What are we doing? Naruto-kun, it is us who should be asking what you are doing." Lee yelled, his bushy eyebrows furrowing in anger. "How could you do that to Tenten-san? I never would have guessed that you would force yourself on." "Whoa, hold the fuck up. She forced herself on me." Another sharp kick to his jaw sent him rolling along the ground, causing him to tumble back first into an especially sharp rock. The kick hadn't hurt as much as the first one, so it had to have come from Neji. "How dare you say such an idiotic and obviously untrue thing? She'd never betray Hinata-sama like that. And to think that she was trying to protect you by calling it an accident." Instantly appearing next to the blonde, the Hyuga picked him up and roughly shoved him up against the nearest tree. "How do you plan to make up for this? Give us one reason why we shouldn't kill you right here and now." Naruto stared into his friend's fierce white eyes with a small amount of fear. He'd only seen the man snap twice in his lifetime. The first time was during the Chunin exams when he fought Hinata, and the second time was when Sai had said something about hiring Hinata as his personal milk dispenser. It was hard to remember exactly what he'd said, as the blonde had suffered a mild concussion while trying to pull the furious Hyuga prodigy off of his still creepily grinning teammate. Thinking quickly, Naruto used the Hiraishin to teleport himself away from Neji. God was he thankful that he hadn't cleaned up his special kunai yet. Unfortunately, he hadn't counted on the fact that Lee would notice the kunai too, and was mildly surprised when the bobble-haired boy launched a powerful fist into his unsuspecting gut. The bitter, coppery taste of blood was prevalent in his mouth, and before he had a chance to recover from the sudden attack, Lee slammed his knee into his chin. Unfortunately, it didn't end there. Out of nowhere, Neji shoved him to the ground and gripped him around the collar, banging the back of his head against the ground. "I asked you a question. How do you plan to make up for this?" When Naruto didn't answer right away, due to the immense pain he was currently experiencing, the Hyuga viciously backhanded him across the face with his free hand. "Huh? I. Naruto started, struggling to come up with a coherent sentence. It was pretty damn hard to think of something to say when your brain was rattling around inside of your head. It took a few seconds, but the Junin was finally able to get his thoughts in order enough to answer the seething man. "I'm going to be there for her and the baby. Forever." The serious, but pained, look on his face caused Neji to loosen his grip slightly, but he quickly tightened it and pulled the boy closer to his face. "What makes you think I'm going to believe you just because you say that? What makes you think you could even hope to support Tenten?" A small grin appeared on the blonde's face, and looking straight into the Anbu officer's eyes, he opened his mouth to speak. "You should know better than anyone. I'll do whatever it takes. I never go back on my word. That's my nindo, my shinobi way." An annoyed frown appeared on Neji's face, But he let go of Naruto's collar, mercifully allowing him to fall back to the ground. Lee looked on in shocked horror, his eyes wide and mouth hanging open at the hinge. Is that all we are going to do to him? After what he did? The man exclaimed, his eyebrows twitching with each word. There's nothing else we can do. This guy's serious. Standing up, he glared down at Naruto one last time. But if we find out that you've made her cry, or hell, even made her sad, we'll come find you. And next time, we won't be nearly as gentle. If this was gentle, Naruto certainly didn't want to find out what the fuck the prodigy considered rough. He watched through heavy-lidded eyes as the men walked away from the field, relieved that the pain was finally over. Granted, he probably could have gotten away if he really wanted to, but it was much better to let them vent their anger right now than to let the frustration build up over time. He knew that lesson quite well. Pushing himself to his feet, he slowly began to uproot and put away his kunai, wincing each time he had to bend over to reach for the weapons. If this was just the first month, he hated to see what the next date would bring. I'm back, Naruto called, stepping through the open doorway and into Tenten's apartment. He waited a few seconds for a reply, and when none came, he shrugged and eased out of his shinobi sandals. His body still ached a bit from the prior beatdown he'd received from his friends, but for the most part, the bastard fox had already healed the more painful wounds. He walked deeper into the apartment, looking for any sign of the brown-haired girl he could find. Her apartment wasn't that much bigger than his, so it only took him a minute or two to figure out that she was in her bedroom. He noticed with a small bit of concern that the door was closed. Usually she kept it open, claiming that it put her at ease to be able to hear everything that went on in her apartment. In fact, he'd only seen it closed once, and that was on the night he'd first started sleeping over at her place. She couldn't take the isolation, though, and had quickly opened it, but not without telling him that she'd tie his penis in a knot if he ever tried to enter her room without permission. Naruto leaned closer to the door, lightly pressing his ear up against it. He couldn't hear much except for what sounded like light sobbing, and placing his hand on the doorknob, he slowly turned and opened the large piece of wood. The room was eerily dark inside, making it damn near impossible to see anything except for the digital alarm clock and a slightly shivering silhouette. Looking closer, he recognized the silhouette as Tenten. "Tenten, are you okay?" Naruto asked, taking a cautious step into the room. The girl noticeably froze when he called her, but she didn't make any move to turn around. "Get out." Her voice was oddly low and shaky, and remembering Neji's words from only half an hour before, the blonde took another step towards the sobbing girl. "Tenten? Tenten-chan? What's wrong? Are you hurt? Do you want me to take you to the hospital?" The Junin slowly nodded her head, causing Naruto to immediately kneel by her side. Shit, Lee and Neji would kill him. Where does it hurt?" he exclaimed, resting his hand on her shoulder. She lifted her head from her arms, looking at him with a tear-streaked and heavily pained face. Even in the dark he could see that she'd drenched the sheets in her tears. Tenten grabbed his hand and placed it over her chest. "Right here." The girl broke down into tears, using her hands to hide her face from his worried eyes. If she looked at him, she'd just cry harder. He was a constant reminder to the unforgivable trespass she'd committed against her former best friend. Naruto's eyes opened wider in understanding as the conversation he'd had with her teammates made sense. "You told Hinata-chan, didn't you?" he asked, keeping his voice as soft as he could. She nodded her head as best as she could with her hands covering her face, her sobbing increasing in force and volume. "I can't do it, Naruto. I can't take this. I don't want to have this baby anymore. I don't want Hinata-chan to hate me. It's too hard." Her body stiffened in surprise when a pair of strong arms encircled her, and she jolted lightly when Naruto pulled her against his chest. "It's not your fault. It was an accident, and you did the right thing by telling her rather than letting her find out on her own. She'll eventually realize how hard it was for you to tell her in your own words, and I'm sure she'll forgive you in no time. Just don't blame yourself, Tenten." Shocked, Tenten slowly lifted her head until she was staring straight into his cerulean blue eyes, marveling at the fact that words like that could come out of the village idiot. Perhaps she'd underestimated his intelligence a bit. She dipped her head back into his chest and leaned a bit more heavily against him, already feeling better than she had only minutes before. He really was good at making people feel better, even if most of the time he did it unintentionally. "Thanks," she murmured, closing her eyes as she relaxed in his arms. Naruto only grunted a response, immensely grateful that he'd dodged that bullet. If word got out to Neji or Lee about this, well. His thoughts were immediately cut off when a pair of lips were pressed firmly against his own, forcing his eyes to open wide and his body to freeze in shock. He eventually regained enough of his motor skills to move his eyeballs downward to stare at the girl who was currently overloading his senses. "What the hell are you doing?" Naruto yelped, pushing away from Tenten and backing up towards the opposite wall. To his chagrin, the girl only followed on her hands and knees, a very dangerous and scary look in her eyes. It didn't help that the shirt she was wearing revealed all of her assets to his fearful eyes. "Thanking you. Are you complaining?" The blonde gaped at her, steadily moving as far away from her as he could. "Of course I am. This is how you got pregnant in the first place. Besides, didn't you say no?" His words fell on deaf ears as she continued to crawl in his direction, a small, nervous grin appearing on her face. He didn't know it, but her heart was thumping powerfully against her ribcage, unable to believe what she was doing. Although it was hard to explain, she somehow felt as though he was all that she had left. Hinata had made it pretty clear that she didn't want anything to do with her anymore, and she couldn't exactly rely on her teammates to help her with the pregnancy or raising of the child. Besides that, she'd been feeling horny as hell for the past week. "What does it matter? It's not like I can get more pregnant, right?" Naruto blinked. Well, she definitely had a point there. "But, we're not even dating or anything like that. Don't you think it feels wrong? People have with strangers all the time. I don't see how this is any worse, since we've known each other for almost 5 years now. Are you gay or something?" The blonde's mouth dropped open. Fuck no. No way. I'm not." Tenten silenced him with another deep kiss, using her hands to push him firmly against the wall. Sometime during their exchange, she had managed to trap an unsuspecting Naruto in the corner, leaving him with absolutely no place to escape to. Worse, all of his kunai were still in the weapons pouch attached to his pants. To his relief, she pulled away long enough to stare him straight in the eyes, the moonlight from the window illuminating his frightened features. "Why don't you want to have with me? Do you think I'm ugly?" she asked, her eyes moistening at the thought. "No, definitely not. You're pretty, really. I just, still like Sakura-chan and stuff." Tenten's eyes immediately narrowed, and her mouth formed a tight, angry line. "Fine, I understand. Then we'll have to do this the hard way." For his part, Naruto was floored by the immediate change in moods. He somehow recalled the book he'd read on pregnancy mentioning extreme mood swings, but he didn't think that they'd be this scary. She'd literally gone from zero to bitch in under 2 seconds. Gulping loudly, he nervously met her eyes. The hard way? What do you mean?" Rather than answer right away, Tenten straddled his lap, arching her face towards his and giving him a menacing glare. "Remember that promise you made 3 weeks ago? The one where you became my bitch?" His eyes widening, Naruto instantly understood what was about to happen. "I see you get it now. If you won't give it to me by choice, I'll have to take it from you by force." Despite his mind's unwillingness to bend to her will, his body was singing a different tune. Something about her forcefulness, turned him on. He didn't have time to ponder his position as a natural uke as Tenten wasted no time in jamming her lips onto his. This kiss was nothing like the previous two. Those had been more careful, tender even. The one she was laying on him now was nothing less than vicious. As she kissed him, her hands set about the task of pulling off his deep orange jacket, sending the garment flying to the other side of the room. That's all for now. If you enjoy, then please like, share and do comments.